Section 27. The Critique of Pure Reason, by Immanuel Kant. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements, Part 2nd. Transcendental Logic. Second Division, Transcendental Dialectic. Book 2. Of the Dialectical Procedure of Pure Reason. Chapter 2. The Antinomy of Pure Reason. Section 3. Of the interest of reason in these self-contradictions. We have thus completely before us the dialectical procedure of the cosmological ideas. No possible experience can present us with an object adequate to them in extent. Nay, more, reason itself cannot cogitate them as according with the general laws of experience. And yet they are not arbitrary fictions of thought. On the contrary, reason, in its uninterrupted progress in the empirical synthesis, is necessarily conducted to them, when it endeavours to free from all conditions and to comprehend in its unconditioned totality that which can only be determined conditionally in accordance with the laws of experience. These dialectical propositions are so many attempts to solve four natural and unavoidable problems of reason. There are neither more, nor can there be less than this number, because there are no other series of synthetical hypotheses limiting a priori the empirical synthesis. The brilliant claims of reason striving to extend its dominion beyond the limits of experience have been represented above only in dry formulae, which contain merely the grounds of its pretensions. They have, besides, in conformity with the character of a transcendental philosophy, been freed from every empirical element, although the full splendor of the promises they hold out, and the anticipations they excite, manifests itself only when in connection with empirical cognitions. In the application of them, however, and in the advancing enlargement of the employment of reason, while struggling to rise from the region of experience and to soar to those sublime ideas, philosophy discovers a value and a dignity which, if it could but make good its assertions, would raise it far above all other departments of human knowledge, professing, as it does, to present a sure foundation for our highest hopes and the ultimate aims of all the exertions of reason. The questions, whether the world has a beginning and a limit to its extension in space, whether there exists anywhere, or perhaps in my own thinking self, an indivisible and indestructible unity, or whether nothing but what is divisible and transitory exists, whether I am a free agent, or, like other beings, am bound in the chains of nature and fate, whether, finally, there is a supreme cause of the world, or all our thought and speculation must end with nature and the order of external things, are questions for the solution of which the mathematician would willingly exchange his whole science, for in it there is no satisfaction for the highest aspirations and most ardent desires of humanity. Nay, it may even be said that the true value of mathematics, that pride of human reason, consists in this, that she guides reason to the knowledge of nature, in her greater as well as in her less manifestations, in her beautiful order and regularity, guides her, moreover, to an insight into the wonderful unity of the moving forces in the operations of nature, far beyond the expectations of a philosophy building only on experience, and that she thus encourages philosophy to extend the province of reason beyond all experience, and at the same time provides it with the most excellent materials for supporting its investigations, in so far as their nature admits, by adequate and accordant intuitions. Unfortunately for speculation, but perhaps fortunately for the practical interests of humanity, reason, in the midst of her highest anticipations, finds herself hemmed in by a press of opposite and contradictory conclusions, from which neither her honor nor her safety will permit her to draw back. Nor can she regard these conflicting trains of reasoning with indifference as mere passages at arms. Still less can she command peace, for in the subject of the conflict she has a deep interest. There is no other course left open to her than to reflect with herself upon the origin of this disunion in reason, whether it may not arise from a mere misunderstanding. After such an inquiry, arrogant claims would have to be given up on both sides, but the sovereignty of reason over understanding and sense would be based upon a sure foundation. We shall, at present, defer this radical inquiry, and, in the meantime, consider for a little what side in the controversy we should most willingly take, if we were obliged to become partisans at all. As, in this case, we leave out of sight altogether the logical criterion of truth, and merely consult our own interest in reference to the question, these considerations, although inadequate to settle the question of right in either party, will enable us to comprehend how those who have taken part in the struggle adopt the one view rather than the other. No special insight into the subject, however, having influenced their choice. They will, at the same time, explain to us many other things by the way. For example, the fiery zeal on the one side, and the cold maintenance of their cause on the other. Why the one party has met with the warmest approbations, and the other has always been repulsed by irreconcilable prejudices. There is one thing, however, that determines the proper point of view, from which alone this preliminary inquiry can be instituted and carried on with the proper completeness, and that is, the comparison of the principles from which both sides, thesis and antithesis, proceed. My readers would remark in the propositions of the antithesis a complete uniformity in the mode of thought and a perfect unity of principle. Its principle was that of pure empiricism, not only in the explication of the phenomena in the world, but also in the solution of the transcendental ideas, even of that of the universe itself. The affirmations of the thesis, on the contrary, were based, in addition to the empirical mode of explanation employed in the series of phenomena, on intellectual propositions, and its principles were insofar not simple. I shall term the thesis, in view of its essential characteristic, the dogmatism of pure reason. On the side of dogmatism, or of the thesis, therefore, in the determination of the cosmological ideas, we find, first, a practical interest, which must be very dear to every right-thinking man. That the world has a beginning, that the nature of my thinking self is simple and therefore indestructible, that I am a free agent and raised above the compulsion of nature and her laws, and finally, that the entire order of things, which form the world, is dependent upon a supreme being, from whom the whole receives unity and connection. These are so many foundation stones of morality and religion. The antithesis deprives us of all these supports, or at least seems so to deprive us. Second, a speculative interest of reason manifests itself on this side. For, if we take the transcendental ideas and employ them in the manner which the thesis directs, we can exhibit completely a priori the entire chain of conditions, and understand the derivation of the conditioned, beginning from the unconditioned. This the antithesis does not do, and for this reason does not meet with so welcome a reception. For it can give no answer to our question respecting the conditions of its synthesis, except such as must be supplemented by another question, and so on to infinity. According to it, we must rise from a given beginning to one still higher. Every part conducts us to a still smaller one. Every event is preceded by another event which is its cause, and the conditions of existence rest always upon other and still higher conditions, and find neither end nor basis in some self-subsistent thing as the primary being. Third, this side has also the advantage of popularity, and this constitutes no small part of its claim to favor. The common understanding does not find the least difficulty in the idea of the unconditioned beginning of all synthesis, accustomed, as it is, rather to allow our consequences than to seek for a proper basis for cognition. In the conception of an absolute first, moreover, the possibility of which it does not inquire into, it is highly gratified to find a firmly established point of departure for its attempts at theory, while, in the restless and continuous ascent from the conditioned to the condition, always with one foot in the air, it can find no satisfaction. On the side of the antithesis, or empiricism, in the determination of the cosmological ideas, first, we cannot discover any such practical interest arising from pure principles of reason as morality and religion present. On the contrary, pure empiricism seems to empty them of all their power and influence. If there does not exist a supreme being distinct from the world, if the world is without beginning, consequently without a creator, if our wills are not free, and the soul is divisible and subject to corruption, just like matter, the ideas and principles of morality lose all validity and fall with the transcendental ideas which constituted their theoretical support. Second, but empiricism, in compensation, holds out to reason, in its speculative interests, certain important advantages, far exceeding any that the dogmatist can promise us. For, when employed by the empiricist, understanding is always upon its proper ground of investigation, the field of possible experience, the laws of which it can explore, and thus extend its cognition securely and with clear intelligence, without being stopped by limits in any direction. Here can it, and ought it, to find and present to intuition its proper object, not only in itself, but in all its relations. Or, if it employ conceptions, upon this ground it can always present the corresponding images in clear and unmistakable intuitions. It is quite unnecessary for it to renounce the guidance of nature, to attach itself to ideas, the objects of which it cannot know, because, as mere intellectual entities, they cannot be presented in any intuition. On the contrary, it is not even permitted to abandon its proper occupation, under the pretense that it has been brought to a conclusion, for it never can be, and to pass into the region of idealizing reason and transcendent conceptions, which it is not required to observe and explore the laws of nature, but merely to think and to examine, secure from being contradicted by facts, because they have not been called as witnesses, but passed by, or perhaps subordinated to the so-called higher interests and considerations of pure reason. Hence, the empiricist will never allow himself to accept any epoch of nature for the first, the absolutely primal state. He will not believe that there can be limits to his outlook into her wide domains, nor pass from the objects of nature, which he can satisfactorily explain by means of observation and mathematical thought, which he can determine synthetically in intuition, to those which neither sense nor imagination can ever present in concreto. He will not concede the existence of a faculty in nature, operating independently of the laws of nature, a concession which would introduce uncertainty into the procedure of the understanding, which is guided by necessary laws to the observation of phenomena. Nor, finally, will he permit himself to seek a cause beyond nature, inasmuch as we know nothing but it, and from it alone receive an objective basis for all our conceptions and instruction in the unvarying laws of things. In truth, if the empirical philosopher had no other purpose in the establishment of his antithesis than to check the presumption of a reason which mistakes its true destination, which boasts of its insight and its knowledge, just where all insight and knowledge cease to exist, and regards that which is valid only in relation to a practical interest as an advancement of the speculative interests of the mind, in order, when it is convenient for itself, to break the thread of our physical investigations, and, under pretense of extending our cognition, connect them with transcendental ideas, by means of which we really know only that we know nothing. If, I say, the empiricist rested satisfied with this benefit, the principle advanced by him would be a maxim recommending moderation in the pretensions of reason, and modesty in its affirmations, and at the same time would direct us to the right mode of extending the province of the understanding, by the help of the only true teacher, experience. In obedience to this advice, intellectual hypotheses and faith would not be called in aid of our practical interests, nor should we introduce them under the pompous titles of science and insight. For speculative cognition cannot help find an objective basis any otherwhere than in experience, and when we overstep its limits, our synthesis, which requires ever new cognitions independent of experience, has no substratum of intuition upon which to build. But if, as often happens, empiricism, in relation to ideas, becomes itself dogmatic, and boldly denies that which is above the sphere of its phenomenal cognition, it falls itself into the error of intemperance, an error which is here all the more reprehensible, as thereby the practical interest of reason receives an irreparable injury. And this constitutes the opposition between Epicureanism and Platonism. Footnote. It is, however, still a matter of doubt whether Epicurus ever propounded these principles as directions for the objective employment of the understanding. If, indeed, they were nothing more than maxims for the speculative exercise of reason, he gives evidence therein of a more genuine philosophic spirit than any of the philosophers of antiquity. That, in the explanation of phenomena, we must proceed as if the field of inquiry had neither limits in space nor commencement in time, that we must be satisfied with the teaching of experience in reference to the material of which the world is posed, that we must not look for any other mode of the origination of events than that which is determined by the unalterable laws of nature, and finally, that we not employ the hypothesis of a cause distinct from the world to account for a phenomenon or for the world itself, are principles for the extension of speculative philosophy, and the discovery of the true sources of the principles of morals, which, however little conformed to in the present day, are undoubtedly correct. At the same time, anyone desirous of ignoring, in mere speculation, these dogmatical propositions, need not for that reason be accused of denying them. Return to text. Both Epicurus and Plato assert more in their systems than they know. The former encourages and advances science, although to the prejudice of the practical. The latter presents us with excellent principles for the investigation of the practical, but, in relation to everything regarding which we can attain to speculative cognition, permits reason to append idealistic explanations of natural phenomena to the great injury of physical investigation. Third, in regard to the third motive for the preliminary choice of a party in this war of assertions, it seems very extraordinary that empiricism should be utterly unpopular. We should be inclined to believe that the common understanding would receive it with pleasure, promising, as it does, to satisfy it without passing the bounds of experience and its connected order, while transcendental dogmatism obliges it to rise to conceptions which far surpass the intelligence and ability of the most practiced thinkers. But in this, in truth, is to be found its real motive. For the common understanding thus finds itself in a situation where not even the most learned can have the advantage of it. If it understands little or nothing about these transcendental conceptions, no one can boast of understanding any more, and although it may not express itself in so scholastically correct a manner as others, it can busy itself with reasoning and arguments without end, wandering among mere ideas, about which one can always be very eloquent, because we know nothing about them, while, in the observation and investigation of nature, it would be forced to remain dumb and to confess its utter ignorance. Thus, indolence and vanity form of themselves strong recommendations of these principles. Besides, although it is a hard thing for a philosopher to assume a principle of which he can give to himself no reasonable account, and still more to employ conceptions, the objective reality of which cannot be established, nothing is more usual with the common understanding. It wants something which will allow it to go to work with confidence. The difficulty of even comprehending a supposition does not disquiet it, because, not knowing what comprehending means, it never even thinks of the supposition it may be adopting as a principle, and regards as known that with which it has become familiar from constant use. And, at last, all speculative interests disappear before the practical interests which it holds dear, and it fancies that it understands and knows what its necessities and hopes incite it to assume or to believe. Thus, the empiricism of transcendentally idealizing reason is robbed of all popularity, and however prejudicial it may be to the highest practical principles, there is no fear that it will ever pass the limits of the schools, or acquire any favor or influence in society or with the multitude. Human reason is by nature architectonic, that is to say, it regards all cognitions as parts of a possible system, and hence accepts only such principles as at least do not incapacitate a cognition to which we may have attained from being placed, along with others, in a general system. But the propositions of the antithesis are of a character which renders the completion of an edifice of cognitions impossible. According to these, beyond one state or epoch of the world, there is always to be found one more ancient, and in every part always other parts themselves divisible, preceding every event another, the origin of which must itself be sought still higher, and everything in existence is conditioned, and still not dependent on an unconditioned and primal existence. As, therefore, the antithesis will not concede the existence of a first beginning which might be available as a foundation, a complete edifice of cognition, in the presence of such hypothesis, is utterly impossible. Thus, the architectonic interest of reason, which requires a unity, not empirical, but a priori and rational, forms a natural recommendation for the assertions of the thesis in our antinomy. But if anyone could free himself entirely from all considerations of interest, and weigh, without partiality, the assertions of reason, attending only to their content, irrespective of the consequences which follow from them, such a person, on the supposition that he knew no other way out of the confusion than to settle the truth of one or other of the conflicting doctrines, would live in a state of continual hesitation. Today, he would feel convinced that the human will is free. Tomorrow, considering the indissoluble chain of nature, he would look on freedom as a mere illusion, and declare nature to be all in all. But, if he were called to action, the play of the merely speculative reason would disappear like the shapes of a dream, and practical interest would dictate his choice of principles. But, as it well befits a reflective and inquiring being to devote certain periods of time to the examination of its own reason, to divest itself of all partiality, and frankly to communicate its observations for the judgment and opinion of others, so no one can be blamed for, much less prevented from, placing both parties on their trial. With permission to end themselves, free from intimidation, before a sworn jury of equal condition with themselves, the condition of weak and fallible men. End Section 3.
Section 28.
This recording is in the public domain.
The Critique of Pure Reason, by Immanuel Kant. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. Part 2nd. Transcendental Logic. Second Division. Transcendental Dialectic. Book 2. Of the Dialectical Procedure of Pure Reason. Chapter 2. The Antinomy of Pure Reason. Sections 4 through 6.
Section 4. Of the necessity imposed upon pure reason of presenting a solution of its transcendental problems. To avow an ability to solve all problems and to answer all questions would be a profession certain to convict any philosopher of extravagant boasting and self-conceit, and at once to destroy the confidence that might otherwise have been reposed in him. There are, however, sciences so constituted that every question arising within their sphere must necessarily be capable of receiving an answer from the knowledge already possessed, for the answer must be received from the same sources whence the question arose. In such sciences, it is not allowable to excuse ourselves on the plea of necessary and unavoidable ignorance. A solution is absolutely requisite. The rule of right and wrong must help us to the knowledge of what is right and wrong in all possible cases. Otherwise, the idea of obligation or duty would be utterly null, for we cannot have any obligation to that which we cannot know. On the other hand, in our investigations of the phenomena of nature, much must remain uncertain, and many questions continue insoluble, because what we know of nature is far from being sufficient to explain all the phenomena that are presented to our observation. Now, the question is, whether there is in transcendental philosophy any question relating to an object presented to pure reason, which is unanswerable by this reason, and whether we must regard the subject of the question as quite uncertain, so far as our knowledge extends, and must give it a place among those subjects of which we have just so much conception as is sufficient to enable us to raise a question, faculty or materials failing us, however, when we attempt an answer. Now, I maintain that, among all speculative cognition, the peculiarity of transcendental philosophy is that there is no question relating to an object presented to pure reason, which is insoluble by this reason, and that the profession of unavoidable ignorance, the problem being alleged to be beyond the reach of our faculties, cannot free us from the obligation to present a complete and satisfactory answer. For the very conception which enables us to raise the question must give us the power of answering it, inasmuch as the object, as in the case of right and wrong, is not to be discovered out of the conception. But in transcendental philosophy, it is only the cosmological questions to which we can demand a satisfactory answer in relation to the constitution of their object, and the philosopher is not permitted to avail himself of the pretext of necessary ignorance and impenetrable obscurity. These questions relate solely to the cosmological ideas, for the object must be given in experience, and the question relates to the adequateness of the object to an idea. If the object is transcendental and therefore itself unknown, if the question, for example, is whether the object, the something, the phenomenon of which, internal in ourselves, is thought, that is to say, the soul, is in itself a simple being, or whether there is a cause of all things which is absolutely necessary, in such cases we are seeking for our idea an object of which we may confess that it is unknown to us, though we must not on that account assert that it is impossible. Footnote. The question, what is the constitution of a transcendental object, is unanswerable. We are unable to say what it is. But we can perceive that the question itself is nothing, because it does not relate to any object that can be presented to us. For this reason, we must consider all the questions raised in transcendental psychology as answerable and as really answered, for they relate to the transcendental subject of all internal phenomena, which is not itself phenomenon, and consequently not given as an object, in which, moreover, none of the categories, and it is to them that the question is properly directed, find any conditions of its application. Here, therefore, is a case where no answer is the only proper answer. For a question regarding the constitution of a something which cannot be cogitated by any determined predicate, being completely beyond the sphere of objects and experience, is perfectly null and void. Back to text. The cosmological ideas alone possess the peculiarity that we can presuppose the object of them and the empirical synthesis requisite for the conception of that object to be given, and the question, which arises from these ideas, relates merely to the progress of this synthesis, in so far as it must contain absolute totality, which, however, is not empirical, as it cannot be given in any experience. Now, as the question here is solely in regard to a thing as the object of a possible experience, and not as a thing in itself, the answer to the transcendental cosmological question need not be sought out of the idea, for the question does not regard an object in itself.
The question in relation to a possible experience is not what can be given in an experience in concreto, but what is contained in the idea to which the empirical synthesis must approximate. The question must therefore be capable of solution from the idea alone, for the idea is a creation of reason itself, which therefore cannot disclaim the obligation to answer or refer us to the unknown object. It is not so extraordinary, as at first sight appears, that a science should demand and expect satisfactory answers to all the questions which may arise within its own sphere, questiones domesticae, although, up to a certain time, these answers may not have been discovered. There are, in addition to transcendental philosophy, only two pure sciences of reason, the one with a speculative, the other with a practical content, pure mathematics and pure ethics. Has anyone ever heard it alleged that, from our complete and necessary ignorance of the conditions, it is uncertain what exact relation the diameter of a circle bears to the circle in rational or irrational numbers? By the former, the sum cannot be given exactly; by the latter, only approximately, and therefore we decide that the impossibility of a solution of the question is evident. Lambert presented us with a demonstration of this. In the general principles of morals, there can be nothing uncertain, for the propositions are either utterly without meaning, or must originate solely in our rational conceptions. On the other hand, there must be in physical science an infinite number of conjectures, which can never become certainties, because the phenomena of nature are not given as objects dependent on our conceptions. The key to the solution of such questions cannot, therefore, be found in our conceptions, or in pure thought, but must lie without us, and for that reason is in many cases not to be discovered, and consequently a satisfactory explanation cannot be expected. The questions of transcendental analytic, which relate to the deduction of our pure cognition, are not to be regarded as of the same kind as those mentioned above, for we are not at present treating of the certainty of judgments in relation to the origin of our conceptions, but only of that certainty in relation to objects. We cannot, therefore, escape the responsibility of at least a critical solution of the questions of reason by complaints of the limited nature of our faculties, and the seemingly humble confession that it is beyond the power of our reason to decide whether the world has existed from all eternity or had a beginning, whether it is infinitely extended or enclosed within certain limits, whether anything in the world is simple, or whether everything must be capable of infinite divisibility, whether freedom can originate phenomena, or whether everything is absolutely dependent on the laws and order of nature, and finally, whether there exists a being that is completely unconditioned and necessary, or whether the existence of everything is conditioned, and consequently dependent on something external to itself, and therefore in its own nature contingent. For all these questions relate to an object which can be given nowhere else than in thought. This object is the absolutely unconditioned totality of the synthesis of phenomena. If the conceptions in our minds do not assist us to some certain result in regard to these problems, we must not defend ourselves on the plea that the object itself remains hidden from and unknown to us. For no such thing, or object, can be given. It is not to be found out of the idea in our minds. We must seek the cause of our failure in our idea itself, which is an insoluble problem, and in regard to which we obstinately assume that there exists a real object corresponding and adequate to it. A clear explanation of the dialectic which lies in our conception will very soon enable us to come to a satisfactory decision in regard to such a question. The pretext that we are unable to arrive at certainty in regard to these problems may be met with this question, which requires at least a plain answer. From what source do the ideas originate, the solution of which involves you in such difficulties? Are you seeking for an explanation of certain phenomena, and do you expect these ideas to give you the principles or the rules of this explanation? Let it be granted that all nature was laid open before you, that nothing was hid from your senses and your consciousness. Still, you could not cognize in concreto the object of your ideas in any experience. For what is demanded is not only this full and complete intuition, but also a complete synthesis and the consciousness of its absolute totality, and this is not possible by means of any empirical cognition. It follows that your question, your idea, is by no means necessary for the explanation of any phenomenon, and the idea cannot have been in any sense given by the object itself. For such an object can never be presented to us, because it cannot be given by any possible experience. Whatever perceptions you may attain to, you are still surrounded by conditions, in space or in time, and you cannot discover anything unconditioned. Nor can you decide whether this unconditioned is to be placed in an absolute beginning of the synthesis, or in an absolute totality of the series without beginning. A whole, in the empirical signification of the term, is always merely comparative. The absolute whole of quantity, the universe, of division, of derivation, of the condition of existence, with the question whether it is to be produced by finite or infinite synthesis, no possible experience can instruct us concerning. You will not, for example, be able to explain the phenomena of a body in the least degree better, whether you believe it to consist of simple or of composite parts. For a simple phenomenon, and just as little an infinite series of composition, can never be presented to your perception. Phenomena require and admit of explanation only in so far as the conditions of that explanation are given in perception. But the sum total of that which is given in phenomena, considered as an absolute whole, is itself a perception, and we cannot therefore seek for explanations of this whole beyond itself in other perceptions. The explanation of this whole is the proper object of the transcendental problems of pure reason. Although, therefore, the solution of these problems is unattainable through experience, we must not permit ourselves to say that it is uncertain how the object of our inquiries is constituted. For the object is in our own mind, and cannot be discovered in experience. And we have only to take care that our thoughts are consistent with each other, and to avoid falling into the amphiboly of regarding our ideas as a representation of an object empirically given, and therefore to be cognized according to the laws of experience. A dogmatical solution is therefore not only unsatisfactory, but impossible. The critical solution, which may be a perfectly certain one, does not consider the question objectively, but proceeds by inquiring into the basis of the cognition upon which the question rests. End section 4. Section 5.
Skeptical exposition of the cosmological problems presented in the four transcendental ideas. We should be quite willing to desist from the demand of a dogmatical answer to our questions, if we understood beforehand that, be the answer what it may, it would only serve to increase our ignorance, to throw us from one incomprehensibility into another, from one obscurity into another still greater, and perhaps lead us into irreconcilable contradictions. If a dogmatical affirmative or negative answer is demanded, is it at all prudent to set aside the probable grounds of a solution which lie before us, and to take into consideration what advantage we shall gain if the answer is to favor the one side or the other? If it happens that in both cases the answer is mere nonsense, we have in this an irresistible summons to institute a critical investigation of the question, for the purpose of discovering whether it is based on a groundless presupposition and relates to an idea the falsity of which would be more easily exposed in its application and consequences than in the mere representation of its content. This is the great utility of the skeptical mode of treating the questions addressed by pure reason to itself. By this method, we easily rid ourselves of the confusions of dogmatism, and establish in its place a temperate criticism, which, as a genuine cathartic, will successfully remove the presumptuous notions of philosophy and their consequence, the vain pretension to universal science. If, then, I could understand the nature of a cosmological idea and perceive, before I entered on the discussion of the subject at all, that, whatever side of the question regarding the unconditioned of the regressive synthesis of phenomena it favored, it must either be too great or too small for every conception of the understanding, I would be able to comprehend how the idea which relates to an object of experience, an experience which must be adequate to and in accordance with a possible conception of the understanding, must be completely void and without significance, inasmuch as its object is inadequate, consider it as we may. And this is actually the case with all cosmological conceptions, which, for the reason above mentioned, involve reason, so long as it remains attached to them in an unavoidable antinomy. For suppose, first, that the world has no beginning. In this case, it is too large for our conception, for this conception, which consists in a successive regress, cannot overtake the whole eternity that has elapsed. Grant that it has a beginning. It is then too small for the conception of the understanding. For as a beginning presupposes a time preceding, it cannot be unconditioned, and the law of the empirical employment of the understanding imposes the necessity of looking for a higher condition of time, and the world is, therefore, evidently too small for this law. The same is the case with the double answer to the question regarding the extent, in space, of the world. For, if it is infinite and unlimited, it must be too large for every possible empirical conception. If it is finite and limited, we have a right to ask, what determines these limits? Void space is not a self-subsistent correlate of things, and cannot be a final condition, and still less an empirical condition, forming a part of a possible experience. For how can we have any experience or perception of an absolute void? But the absolute totality of the empirical synthesis requires that the unconditioned be an empirical conception. Consequently, a finite world is too small for our conception. Secondly, if every phenomenon, matter, in space,
consists of an infinite number of parts, the regress of the division is always too great for our conception. And if the division of space must cease with some member of the division, the simple, it is too small for the idea of the unconditioned. For the member at which we have discontinued our division still admits a regress to many more parts contained in the object. Thirdly, suppose that every event in the world happens in accordance with the laws of nature. The causality of a cause must itself be an event, and necessitates a regress to a still higher cause, and consequently the unceasing prolongation of the series of conditions a parte priori. Operative nature is therefore too large for every conception we can form in the synthesis of cosmical events. If we admit the existence of spontaneously produced events, that is, of free agency, we are driven in our search for sufficient reasons on an unavoidable law of nature, and are compelled to appeal to the empirical law of causality. And we find that any such totality of connection in our synthesis is too small for our necessary empirical conception. Fourthly, if we assume the existence of an absolutely necessary being, whether it be the world, or something in the world, or the cause of the world, we must place it in a time at an infinite distance from any given moment, for otherwise it must be dependent on some other and higher existence. Such an existence is, in this case, too large for our empirical conception, and unattainable by the continued regress of any synthesis. But if we believe that everything in the world, be it condition or conditioned, is contingent, every given existence is too small for our conception, for in this case we are compelled to seek for some other existence upon which the former depends. We have said that, in all these cases, the cosmological idea is either too great or too small for the empirical regress in a synthesis, and consequently for every possible conception of the understanding. Why did we not express ourselves in a manner exactly the reverse of this, and, instead of accusing the cosmological idea of overstepping, or of falling short of its true aim, possible experience, say that, in the first case, the empirical conception is always too small for the idea, and in the second, too great, and thus attach the blame of these contradictions to the empirical regress? The reason is this: possible experience can alone give reality to our conceptions. Without it, a conception is merely an idea, without truth or relation to an object. Hence, a possible empirical conception must be the standard by which we are to judge whether an idea is anything more than an idea and fiction of thought, or whether it relates to an object in the world. If we say of a thing that in relation to some other thing it is too large or too small, the former is considered as existing for the sake of the latter, and requiring to be adapted to it. Among the trivial subjects of discussion in the old schools of dialectics was this question: if a ball cannot pass through a hole, shall we say that the ball is too large, or the hole too small? In this case, it is indifferent what expression we employ, for we do not know which exists for the sake of the other. On the other hand, we cannot say, the man is too long for his coat, but the coat is too short for the man. We are thus led to the well-founded suspicion that the cosmological ideas, and all the conflicting sophistical assertions connected with them, are based upon a false
and fictitious conception of the mode in which the object of these ideas is presented to us, and this suspicion will probably direct us how to expose the illusion that has so long led us astray from the truth. End section 5. Section 6. Transcendental idealism as the key to the solution of pure cosmological dialectic. In the transcendental aesthetic, we proved that everything intuited in space and time, all objects of a possible experience, are nothing but phenomena, that is, mere representations, and that these, as presented to us, as extended bodies or as a series of changes, have no self-subsistent existence apart from human thought. This doctrine I call transcendental idealism. Footnote. I have elsewhere termed this theory formal idealism to distinguish it from material idealism, which doubts or denies the existence of external things. To avoid ambiguity, it seems advisable in many cases to employ this term instead of that mentioned in the text. Back to text. The realist, in the transcendental sense, regards these modifications of our sensibility, these mere representations, as things subsisting in themselves. It would be unjust to accuse us of holding the long decried theory of empirical idealism, which, while admitting the reality of space, denies, or at least doubts, the existence of bodies extended in it, and thus leaves us without a sufficient criterion of reality and illusion. The supporters of this theory find no difficulty in admitting the reality of the phenomena of the internal sense in time. Nay, they go the length of maintaining that this internal experience is of itself a sufficient proof of the real existence of its object as a thing in itself. Transcendental idealism allows that the objects of external intuition, as intuited in space and all changes in time, as represented by the internal sense, are real. For, as space is the form of that intuition which we call external, and without objects in space, no empirical representation could be given us, we can and ought to regard extended bodies in it as real. The case is the same with representations in time. But time and space, with all phenomena therein, are not in themselves things. They are nothing but representations, and cannot exist out of and apart from the mind. Nay, the sensuous internal intuition of the mind, as the object of consciousness, the determination of which is represented by the succession of different states in time, is not the real proper self, as it exists in itself, not the transcendental subject, but only a phenomenon which is presented to the sensibility of this, to us, unknown being. This internal phenomenon cannot be admitted to be a self-subsisting thing, for its condition is time, and time cannot be the condition of a thing in itself. But the empirical truth of phenomena in space and time is guaranteed beyond the possibility of doubt, and sufficiently distinguished from the illusion of dreams or fancy, although both have a proper and thorough connection in an experience according to empirical laws. The objects of experience, then, are not things in themselves, but are given only in experience, and have no existence apart from and independently of experience. That there may be inhabitants in the moon, although no one has ever observed them,
must certainly be admitted, but this assertion means only that we may, in the possible progress of experience, discover them at some future time. For that which stands in connection with a perception, according to the laws of the progress of experience, is real. They are therefore really existent, if they stand in empirical connection with my actual or real consciousness, although they are not in themselves real, that is, apart from the progress of experience. There is nothing actually given. We can be conscious of nothing as real, except a perception and the empirical progression from it to other possible perceptions. For phenomena, as mere representations, are real only in perception, and perception is, in fact, nothing but the reality of an empirical representation, that is, a phenomenon. To call a phenomenon a real thing prior to perception means either that we must meet with this phenomenon in the progress of experience, or it means nothing at all. For I can say only of a thing in itself that it exists without relation to the senses and experience. But we are speaking here merely of phenomena in space and time, both of which are determinations of sensibility, and not of things in themselves. It follows that phenomena are not things in themselves, but are mere representations, which, if not given in us, in perception, are non-existent. The faculty of sensuous intuition is properly a receptivity, a capacity of being affected in a certain manner by representations, the relation of which to each other is a pure intuition of space and time, the pure forms of sensibility. These representations, in so far as they are connected and determinable in this relation, in space and time, according to the laws of the unity of experience, are called objects. The non-sensuous cause of these representations is completely unknown to us, and hence cannot be intuited as an object. For such an object could not be represented either in space or in time, and without these conditions, intuition or representation is impossible. We may at the same time term the non-sensuous cause of phenomena the transcendental object, but merely as a mental correlate to sensibility, considered as a receptivity. To this transcendental object we may attribute the whole connection and extent of our possible perceptions, and say that it is given and exists in itself prior to all experience. But the phenomena corresponding to it are not given as things in themselves, but in experience alone, for they are mere representations, receiving from perceptions alone significance and relation to a real object, under the condition that this or that perception, indicating an object, is in complete connection with all others in accordance with the rules of the unity of experience. Thus we can say, the things that really existed in past time are given in the transcendental object of experience. But these are to me real objects only insofar as I can represent to my own mind that a regressive series of possible perceptions, following the indications of history or the footsteps of cause and effect, in accordance with empirical laws, that, in one word, the course of the world conducts us to an elapsed series of time as the condition of the present time. This series in past time is represented as real, not in itself, but only in connection with a possible experience. Thus, when I say that certain events occurred in past time, I merely assert the possibility of prolonging the chain of experience from the present perception upwards to the conditions that determine it according to time. If I represent to myself all objects existing in all space and time, I do not thereby place these in space and time prior to all experience. On the contrary, such a representation is nothing more than the notion of a possible experience in its absolute completeness. In experience alone are those objects, which are nothing but representations, given. But when I say they existed prior to my experience, this means only that I must begin with the perception present to me and follow the track indicated until I discover them in some part or region of experience. The cause of the empirical condition of this progression, and consequently at what member therein I must stop, and at what point in the regress I am to find this member, is transcendental, and hence necessarily incognizable. But with this we have not to do. Our concern is only with the law of progression in experience, in which objects, that is, phenomena, are given. It is a matter of indifference whether I say, I may in the progress of experience discover stars at 100 times greater distance than the most distant of those now visible, or stars at this distance may be met in space, although no one has, or ever will discover them. For, if they are given as things in themselves without any relation to possible experience, they are for me non-existent, consequently are not objects, for they are not contained in the regressive series of experience. But if these phenomena must be employed in the construction or support of the cosmological idea of an absolute whole, and when we are discussing a question that oversteps the limits of possible experience, the proper distinction of the different theories of the reality of sensuous objects is of great importance, in order to avoid the illusion which must necessarily arise from the misinterpretation of our empirical conceptions. End section 6. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 29. The Critique of Pure Reason, by Immanuel Kant. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements, Part 2nd, Transcendental Logic. Second Division, Transcendental Dialectic. Book 2, of the Dialectical Procedure of Pure Reason. Chapter 2, The Antinomy of Pure Reason. Sections 7 and 8.
Section 7. Critical solution of the cosmological problem. The antinomy of pure reason is based upon the following dialectical argument. If that which is conditioned is given, the whole series of its conditions is also given. But sensuous objects are given as conditioned, consequently. This syllogism, the major of which seems so natural and evident, introduces as many cosmological ideas as there are different kinds of conditions in the synthesis of phenomena, insofar as these conditions constitute a series. These ideas require absolute totality in the series, and thus place reason in inextricable embarrassment. Before proceeding to expose the fallacy in this dialectical argument, it will be necessary to have a correct understanding of certain conceptions that appear in it. In the first place, the following proposition is evident and indubitably certain. If the conditioned is given, a regress in the series of all its conditions is thereby imperatively required. For the very conception of a conditioned is a conception of something related to a condition, and if this condition is itself conditioned to another condition, and so on, through all the members of the series. This proposition is, therefore, analytical, and has nothing to fear from transcendental criticism. It is a logical postulate of reason to pursue, as far as possible, the connection of a conception with its conditions. If, in the second place, both the conditioned and the condition are things in themselves, and if the former is given, not only is the regress to the latter requisite, but the latter is really given with the former. Now, as this is true of all the members of the series, the entire series of conditions, and with them the unconditioned, is at the same time given in the very fact of the conditioned, the existence of which is possible only in and through that series being given. In this case, the synthesis of the conditioned with its condition is a synthesis of the understanding merely, which represents things as they are, without regarding whether and how we can cognize them. But if I have to do with phenomena, which, in their character of mere representations, are not given, if I do not attain to a cognition of them, in other words, to themselves, for they are nothing more than empirical cognitions, I am not entitled to say, if the conditioned is given, all its conditions as phenomena are also given. I cannot, therefore, from the fact of a conditioned being given, infer the absolute totality of the series of its conditions. For phenomena are nothing but an empirical synthesis in apprehension or perception, and are therefore given only in it. Now, in speaking of phenomena, it does not follow that, if the conditioned is given, the synthesis which constitutes its empirical condition is also thereby given and presupposed. Such a synthesis can be established only by an actual regress in the series of conditions. But we are entitled to say, in this case, that a regress to the conditions of a conditioned, in other words, that a continuous empirical synthesis is enjoined, that, if the conditions are not given, they are at least required, and that we are certain to discover the conditions in this regress. We can now see that the major, in the above cosmological syllogism, takes the conditioned in the transcendental signification which it has in the pure category, while the minor speaks of it in the empirical signification which it has in the category as applied to phenomena. There is, therefore, a dialectical fallacy in the syllogism, a sophisma figurae dictionis. But this fallacy is not a consciously devised one, but a perfectly natural illusion of the common reason of man. For, when a thing is given as conditioned, we presuppose in the major its conditions and their series, unperceived, as it were, and unseen, because this is nothing more than the logical requirement of complete and satisfactory premises for a given conclusion. In this case, time is altogether left out in the connection of the conditioned with the condition. They are supposed to be given in themselves and contemporaneously. It is, moreover, just as natural to regard phenomena, in the minor, as things in themselves and as objects presented to the pure understanding, as in the major, in which complete abstraction was made of all conditions of intuition. But it is under these conditions alone that objects are given. Now, we overlooked a remarkable distinction between the conceptions. The synthesis of the conditioned with its condition, and the complete series of the latter in the major, are not limited by time, and do not contain the conception of succession. On the contrary, The empirical synthesis and the series of conditions in the phenomenal world, subsumed in the minor, are necessarily successive and given in time alone. It follows that I cannot presuppose in the minor, as I did in the major, the absolute totality of the synthesis and of the series therein represented. For in the major, all the members of the series are given as things in themselves, without any limitations or conditions of time, while in the minor they are possible only in and through a successive regress, which cannot exist except it be actually carried into execution in the world of phenomena. After this proof of the viciousness of the argument commonly employed in maintaining cosmological assertions, both parties may now be justly dismissed, as advancing claims without grounds or title. But the process has not been ended by convincing them that one or both were in the wrong, and had maintained an assertion which was without valid grounds of proof. Nothing seems to be clearer than that, if one maintains the world has a beginning, and another the world has no beginning, one of the two must be right. But it is likewise clear that, if the evidence on both sides is equal, it is impossible to discover on what side the truth lies, and the controversy continues, although the parties have been recommended to peace before the tribunal of reason. There remains, then, no other means of settling the question than to convince the parties, who refute each other with such conclusiveness and ability, that they are disputing about nothing, and that a transcendental illusion has been mocking them with visions of reality where there is none. The mode of adjusting a dispute which cannot be decided upon its own merits, we shall now proceed to lay before our readers. Zeno of Elea, a subtle dialectician, was severely reprimanded by Plato as a sophist, who, merely from the base motive of exhibiting his skill in discussion, maintained and subverted the same proposition by arguments as powerful and convincing on the one side as on the other. He maintained, for example, that God, who was probably nothing more in his view than the world, is neither finite nor infinite, neither in motion nor in rest, neither similar nor dissimilar to any other thing. It seemed to those philosophers who criticized his mode of discussion that his purpose was to deny completely both of two self-contradictory positions, which is absurd. But I cannot believe that there is any justice in this accusation. The first of these propositions I shall presently consider in a more detailed manner. With regard to the others, if by the word of God he understood merely the universe, his meaning must have been that it cannot be permanently present in one place, that is, at rest, nor be capable of changing its place, that is, of moving, because all places are in the universe, and the universe itself is, therefore, in no place. Again, if the universe contains in itself everything that exists, it cannot be similar or dissimilar to any other thing, because there is, in fact, no other thing with which it can be compared. If two opposite judgments presuppose a contingent, impossible, or arbitrary condition, both, in spite of their opposition, which is, however, not properly or really a contradiction, fall away, because the condition, which ensured the validity of both, has itself disappeared. If we say, every body has either a good or a bad smell, we have omitted a third possible judgment: it has no smell at all, and thus both conflicting statements may be false. If we say, it is either good smelling or not good smelling, vel suavolens, vel non suavolens, both judgments are contradictorily opposed, and the contradictory opposite of the former judgment, some bodies are not good smelling, embraces also those bodies which have no smell at all. In the preceding pair of opposed judgments, per disparata, the contingent condition of the conception of body, smell, attached to both conflicting statements, instead of having been omitted in the latter, which is consequently not the contradictory opposite of the former. If, accordingly, we say, the world is either infinite in extension, or it is not infinite, non est infinitus, and if the former proposition is false, its contradictory opposite, the world is not infinite, must be true. And thus I should deny the existence of an infinite, without, however, affirming the existence of a finite world. But if we construct our proposition thus, the world is either infinite or finite, non-infinite, both statements may be false. For, in this case, we consider the world as per se determined in regard to quantity, and while in the one judgment we deny its infinite and consequently, perhaps, its independent existence, in the other we append to the world, regarded as a thing in itself, a certain determination, that of finitude, and the latter may be false as well as the former, if the world is not given as a thing in itself, and thus neither as finite nor as infinite in quantity. This kind of opposition I may be allowed to term dialectical. That of contradictories may be called analytical opposition. Thus, then, of two dialectically opposed judgments, both may be false, from the fact that the one is not a mere contradictory of the other, but actually enounces more than is requisite for a full and complete contradiction. When we regard the two propositions, the world is infinite in quantity, and the world is finite in quantity, as contradictory opposites, we are assuming that the world, the complete series of phenomena, is a thing in itself. For it remains as a permanent quantity, whether I deny the infinite or the finite regress in the series of its phenomena. But if we dismiss this assumption, this transcendental illusion, and deny that it is a thing in itself, the contradictory opposition is metamorphosed into a merely dialectical one, and the world, as not existing in itself, independently of the regressive series of my representations, exists in like manner neither as a whole which is infinite, nor as a whole which is finite in itself. The universe exists for me only in the empirical regress of the series of phenomena, and not per se. If, then, it is always conditioned, it is never completely or as a whole, and it is therefore not an unconditioned whole, and does not exist as such, either with an infinite or with a finite quantity. What we have here said of the first cosmological idea, that of the absolute totality of quantity and phenomena, applies also to the others. A series of conditions is discoverable only in the regressive synthesis itself, and not in the phenomenon considered as a thing in itself, given prior to all regress. Hence, I am compelled to say, the aggregate of parts in a given phenomenon is, in itself, neither finite nor infinite, and these parts are given only in the regressive synthesis of decomposition, a synthesis which is never given in absolute completeness, either as finite or as infinite. The same is the case with the series of subordinated causes, or of the conditioned up to the unconditioned and necessary existence, which can never be regarded as in itself and in its totality either as finite or as infinite, because as a series of subordinate representations it subsists only in the dynamical regress, and cannot be regarded as existing previously to this regress, or as a self-subsistent series of things. Thus, the antinomy of pure reason in its cosmological ideas disappears. For the above demonstration has established the fact that it is merely the product of a dialectical and illusory opposition, which arises from the application of the idea of absolute totality, admissible only as a condition of things in themselves, to phenomena which exist only in our representations, and, when constituting a series, in successive regress. This antinomy of reason may, however, be really profitable to our speculative interests, not in the way of contributing any dogmatical addition, but as presenting to us another material support in our critical investigations. For it furnishes us with an indirect proof of the transcendental ideality of phenomena, if our minds were not completely satisfied with the direct proof set forth in the Transcendental Aesthetic. The proof would proceed in the following dilemma. If the world is a whole existing in itself, it must be either finite or infinite. But it is neither finite nor infinite, as has been shown on the one side by the thesis, on the other by the antithesis. Therefore the world, the content of all phenomena, is not a whole existing in itself. It follows that phenomena are nothing apart from our representations, and this is what we mean by transcendental ideality. This remark is of some importance. It enables us to see that the proofs of the fourfold antinomy are not mere sophistries, are not fallacious, but grounded on the nature of reason and valid, under the supposition that phenomena are things in themselves. The opposition of the judgments which follow makes it evident that a fallacy lay in the initial supposition, and thus helps us to discover the true constitution of objects of sense. This transcendental dialectic does not favor skepticism, although it presents us with a triumphant demonstration of the advantages of the skeptical method, the great utility of which is apparent in the antinomy, where the arguments of reason were allowed to confront each other in undiminished force. And although the result of these conflicts of reason is not what we expected, although we have obtained no positive dogmatical addition to metaphysical science, we have still reaped a great advantage in the correction of our judgments on these subjects of thought. End section 7. Section 8. Regulative principle of pure reason in relation to the cosmological ideas. The cosmological principle of totality could not give us any certain knowledge in regard to the maximum in the series of conditions in the world of sense considered as a thing in itself. The actual regress in the series is the only means of approaching this maximum. This principle of pure reason, therefore, may still be considered as valid, not as an axiom enabling us to cogitate totality in the object as actual, but as a problem for the understanding, which requires it to institute and to continue, in conformity with the idea of totality in the mind, the regress in the series of the conditions of a given conditioned. For, In the world of sense, that is, in space and time, every condition which we discover in our investigation of phenomena is itself conditioned, because sensuous objects are not things in themselves, in which case an absolutely unconditioned might be reached in the progress of cognition, but are merely empirical representations, the conditions of which must always be found in intuition. The principle of reason is therefore properly a mere rule, prescribing a regress in the series of conditions for a given phenomena, and prohibiting any pause or rest on an absolutely unconditioned. It is, therefore, not a principle of the possibility of experience or of the empirical cognition of sensuous objects, consequently, not a principle of the understanding. For every experience is confined within certain proper limits determined by the given intuition. Still less is it a constitutive principle of reason, authorizing us to extend our conception of the sensuous world beyond all possible experience. It is merely a principle for the enlargement and extension of experience as far as is possible for human faculties. It forbids us to consider any empirical limits as absolute. It is, hence, a principle of reason, which, as a rule, dictates how we ought to proceed in our empirical regress, but is unable to anticipate or indicate prior to the empirical regress what is given in the object itself. I have termed it, for this reason, a regulative principle of reason, while the principle of the absolute totality of the series of conditions, as existing in itself and given in the object, is a constitutive cosmological principle. This distinction will at once demonstrate the falsehood of the constitutive principle, and prevent us from attributing, by a transcendental subreptio, objective reality to an idea, which is valid only as a rule. In order to understand the proper meaning of this rule of pure reason, we must notice, first, that it cannot tell us what the object is, but only how the empirical regress is to be proceeded with in order to obtain to the complete conception of the object. If it gave us any information in respect to the former statement, it would be a constitutive principle, a principle impossible from the nature of pure reason. It will not therefore enable us to establish any such conclusions as the series of conditions for a given conditioned is in itself finite, or it is infinite, for, in this case, we should be cogitating in the mere idea of absolute totality, an object which is not and cannot be given in experience, inasmuch as we should be attributing a reality objective and independent of the empirical synthesis to a series of phenomena. This idea of reason cannot then be regarded as valid except as a rule for the regressive synthesis in the series of conditions, according to which we must proceed from the conditioned through all intermediate and subordinate conditions up to the unconditioned, although this goal is unattained and unattainable. For the absolutely unconditioned cannot be discovered in the sphere of experience. We now proceed to determine clearly our notion of a synthesis which can never be complete. There are two terms commonly employed for this purpose. These terms are regarded as expressions of different and distinguishable notions, although the ground of the distinction has never been clearly exposed. The term employed by the mathematicians is progressus in infinitum. The philosophers prefer the expression progressus in indefinitum. Without detaining the reader with an examination of the reasons for such a distinction, or with remarks on the right or wrong use of the terms, I shall endeavor clearly to determine these conceptions, so far as is necessary for the purpose in this critique. We may with propriety say of a straight line, that it may be produced to infinity. In this case, the distinction between a progressus in infinitum and a progressus in indefinitum is a mere piece of subtlety. For, although when we say produce a straight line, it is more correct to say in indefinitum than in infinitum, because the former means produce it as far as you please, the second, you must not cease to produce it. The expression in infinitum is, when we are speaking of the power to do it, perfectly correct, for we can always make it longer if we please, on to infinity. And this remark holds good in all cases. When we speak of a progressus, that is, an advancement from the condition to the conditioned, this possible advancement always proceeds to infinity. We may proceed from a given pair in the descending line of generation from father to son, and cogitate a never-ending line of descendants from it. For in such a case, reason does not demand absolute totality in the series, because it does not presuppose it as a condition and as given datum, but merely as conditioned and capable of being given dabile. Very different is the case with the problem, how far the regress which ascends from the given conditioned to the conditions must extend. Whether, I can say, it is a regress in infinitum or only in indefinitum, and whether, for example, setting out from the human beings at present alive in the world, I may ascend in the series of their ancestors in infinitum, or whether all that can be said is that, so far as I have proceeded, I have discovered no empirical ground for considering the series limited, so that I am justified, and indeed compelled, to search for ancestors still further back, although I am not obliged by the idea of reason to presuppose them. My answer to this question is, if the series is given in empirical intuition as a whole, the regress in the series of its internal conditions proceeds in infinitum. But if only one member of the series is given, from which the regress is to proceed to absolute totality, the regress is possible only in indefinitum. For example, the division of a portion of matter given, within certain limits, of a body, that is, proceeds in infinitum, for as the condition of this whole is its part, and the condition of the part a part of the part, and so on, and as, in this regress of decomposition, an unconditioned indivisible member of the series of conditions is not to be found, there are no reasons or grounds in experience for stopping in the division, but, on the contrary, the more remote members of the division are actually and empirically given prior to this division. That is to say, the division proceeds to infinity. On the other hand, the series of ancestors of any given human being is not given in its absolute totality in any experience, and yet the regress proceeds from every genealogical member of this series to one still higher, and does not meet with any empirical limit presenting an absolutely unconditioned member of the series. But as the members of such a series are not contained in the empirical intuition of the whole, prior to the regress, this regress does not proceed to infinity, but only in indefinitum, that is, we are called upon to discover other and higher members, which are themselves always conditioned. in neither case, the regressus in infinitum nor the regressus in indefinitum is the series of conditions to be considered as actually infinite in the object itself. This might be true of things in themselves, but it cannot be asserted of phenomena which, as conditions of each other, are only given in the empirical regress itself. Hence the question no longer is, what is the quantity of this series of conditions in itself, is it finite or infinite? For it is nothing in itself, but how is the empirical regress to be commenced, and how far ought we to proceed with it? And here a signal distinction in the application of this rule becomes apparent. If the whole is given empirically, it is possible to proceed in the series of its internal conditions to infinity. But if the whole is not given, and can only be given by and through the empirical regress, I can only say, it is possible to infinity to proceed to still higher conditions in the series. In the first case, I am justified in asserting that more members are empirically given in the object than I attain to in the regress of decomposition. In the second case, I am justified only in saying that I can always proceed further in the regress, because no member of the series is given as absolutely conditioned, and thus a higher member is possible, and an inquiry with regard to it is necessary. In the one case, it is necessary to find other members of the series; in the other, it is necessary to inquire for others, inasmuch as experience presents no absolute limitation of the regress. For either you do not possess a perception which absolutely limits your empirical regress, and in this case the regress cannot be regarded as complete, or you do possess such a limitive perception, in which case it is not a part of your series, for that which limits must be distinct from that which is limited by it, and it is incumbent upon you to continue your regress up to this condition, and so on. These remarks will be placed in their proper light by their application in the following section. End Section 8. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. Section 30. The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. Part 2nd. Transcendental Logic. Second Division. Transcendental Dialectic. Book 2. Of the Dialectical Procedure of Pure Reason. Chapter 2. The Antinomy of Pure Reason. Section 9. Of the empirical use of the regulative principle of reason with regard to the cosmological ideas. 1 and 2. The solution of the transcendental mathematical ideas, and introductory to the solution of the dynamical ideas. Section 9. Of the empirical use of the regulative principle of reason with regard to the cosmological ideas. We have shown that no transcendental use can be made either of the conceptions of reason or of understanding. We have shown, likewise, that the demand of absolute totality in the series of conditions in the world of sense arises from a transcendental employment of reason, resting on the opinion that phenomena are to be regarded as things in themselves,
it follows that we are not required to answer the question respecting the absolute quantity of a series, whether it is in itself limited or unlimited. We are only called upon to determine how far we must proceed in the empirical regress from condition to condition in order to discover, in conformity with the rule of reason, a full and correct answer to the questions proposed by reason itself. The principle of reason is hence valid only as a rule for the extension of a possible experience, its invalidity as a principle constitutive of phenomena in themselves having been sufficiently demonstrated. And thus, too, the antinomial conflict of reason with itself is completely put an end to, inasmuch as we have not only presented a critical solution of the fallacy lurking in the opposite statements of reason, but have shown the true meaning of the ideas which gave rise to these statements. The dialectical principle of reason has, therefore, been changed into a doctrinal principle. But in fact, if this principle, in the subjective signification which we have shown to be its only true sense, may be guaranteed as a principle of the unceasing extension of the employment of our understanding, its influence and value are just as great as if it were an axiom for the a priori determination of objects. For such an axiom could not exert a stronger influence on the extension and rectification of our knowledge, otherwise than by procuring, for the principles of the understanding, the most widely expanded employment in the field of experience. 1. Solution of the cosmological idea of the totality of the composition of phenomena in the universe. Here, as well as in the case of the other cosmological problems, the ground of the regulative principle of reason is the proposition that, in our empirical regress, no experience of an absolute limit, and consequently no experience of a condition, which is itself absolutely unconditioned, is discoverable. And the truth of this proposition itself rests upon the consideration that such an experience must represent to us phenomena as limited by nothing, or the mere void, on which our continued regress by means of perception must abut, which is impossible. Now, this proposition, which declares that every condition attained in the empirical regress must itself be considered empirically conditioned, contains the rule in terminis, which requires me, to whatever extent I may have proceeded in the ascending series, always to look for some higher member in the series, whether this member is to become known to me through experience or not. Nothing further is necessary, then, for the solution of the first cosmological problem than to decide whether, in the regress to the unconditioned quantity of the universe, as regards space and time, this never-limited ascent ought to be called a regressus in infinitum, or in indefinitum. The general representation which we form in our minds of the series of all past states or conditions of the world, or of all the things which at present exist in it, is itself nothing more than a possible empirical regress which is cogitated, although in an undetermined manner, in the mind, and which gives rise to the conception of a series of conditions for a given object. Footnote. The cosmical series can neither be greater nor smaller than the possible empirical regress upon which its conception is based. And as this regress cannot be a determinate infinite regress, still less a determinate finite, absolutely limited, it is evident that we cannot regard the world as either finite or infinite, because the regress, which gives us the representation of the world, is neither finite nor infinite. Back to text. Now, I have a conception of the universe, but not an intuition, that is, not an intuition of it as a whole. Thus, I cannot infer the magnitude of the regress from the quantity or magnitude of the world, and determine the former by means of the latter. On the contrary, I must first of all form a conception of the quantity or magnitude of the world from the magnitude of the empirical regress. But of this regress, I know nothing more than that I ought to proceed from every given member of the series of conditions to one still higher. But the quantity of the universe is not thereby determined, and we cannot affirm that this regress proceeds in infinitum. Such an affirmation would anticipate the members of the series which have not yet been reached, and represent the number of them as beyond the grasp of any empirical synthesis. It would consequently determine the cosmical quantity prior to the regress, although only in a negative manner, which is impossible. For the world is not given in its totality in any intuition. Consequently, its quantity cannot be given prior to the regress. It follows that we are unable to make any declaration respecting the cosmical quantity in itself, not even that the regress in it is a regress in infinitum. We must only endeavor to attain to a conception of the quantity of the universe in conformity with the rule which determines the empirical regress in it. But this rule merely requires us never to admit an absolute limit to our series, how far soever we may have proceeded in it, but always, on the contrary, to subordinate every phenomenon to some other as its condition, and consequently to proceed to this higher phenomenon. Such a regress is, therefore, the regressus in indefinitum, which, as not determining a quantity in the object, is clearly distinguishable from the regressus in infinitum. It follows from what we have said that we are not justified in declaring the world to be infinite in space, or as regards past time. For this conception of an infinite given quantity is empirical, but we cannot imply the conception of an infinite quantity to the world as an object of the senses. I cannot say, the regress from a given perception to everything limited either in space or time proceeds in infinitum, for this presupposes an infinite cosmical quantity. Neither can I say, it is finite, for an absolute limit is likewise impossible in experience. It follows that I am not entitled to make any assertion at all regarding the whole object of experience, the world of sense. I must limit my declarations to the rule according to which experience, or empirical knowledge, is to be attained. To the question, therefore, respecting the cosmical quantity, the first and negative answer is, the world has no beginning in time and no absolute limit in space. For, in the contrary case, it would be limited by a void time on the one hand and by a void space on the other. Now, since the world, as a phenomenon, cannot be thus limited in itself, for a phenomenon is not a thing in itself, it must be possible for us to have a perception of this limitation by a void time and a void space. But such a perception, such an experience, is impossible, because it has no content. Consequently, an absolute cosmical limit is empirically, and therefore absolutely, impossible. Footnote. The reader will remark that the proof presented above is very different from the dogmatical demonstration given in the antithesis of the first antinomy. In that demonstration, it was taken for granted that the world is a thing in itself, given in its totality, prior to all regress, and a determined position in space and time was denied to it, if it was not considered as occupying all time and all space.
Hence our conclusion differed from that given above, for we inferred in the antithesis the actual infinity of the world. Back to text. From this follows the affirmative answer. The regress in the series of phenomena, as a determination of the cosmical quantity, proceeds in indefinitum. This is equivalent to saying, the world of sense has no absolute quantity, but the empirical regress, through which alone the world of sense is presented to us on the side of its conditions, rests upon a rule, which requires it to proceed from every member of the series as conditioned to one still more remote, whether through personal experience or by means of history or the chain of cause and effect, and not to cease at any point in this extension of the possible empirical employment of the understanding. And this is the proper and only use which reason can make of its principles. The above rule does not prescribe an unceasing regress in one kind of phenomena. It does not, for example, forbid us in our ascent from an individual human being through the line of his ancestors to expect that we shall discover at some point of the regress a primeval pair, or to admit, in the series of heavenly bodies, a sun at the farthest possible distance from some center. All that it demands is a perpetual progress from phenomena to phenomena, even although an actual perception is not presented by them, as in the case of our perceptions being so weak as that we are unable to become conscious of them, since they nevertheless belong to possible experience. Every beginning is in time, and all limits to extension are in space. But space and time are in the world of sense. Consequently, phenomena in the world are conditionally limited, but the world itself is not limited, either conditionally or unconditionally. For this reason, and because neither the world nor the cosmical series of conditions to a given conditioned can be completely given, our conception of the cosmical quantity is given only in and through the regress, and not prior to it, in a collective intuition. But the regress itself is really nothing more than the determining of the cosmical quantity, and cannot therefore give us any determined conception of it, still less a conception of a quantity which is, in relation to a certain standard, infinite. The regress does not, therefore, proceed to infinity, an infinity given, but only to an indefinite extent, for the purpose of presenting to us a quantity realized only in and through the regress itself. (2) Solution of the cosmological idea of the totality of the division of a whole given in intuition. When I divide a whole which is given in intuition, I proceed from a conditioned to its conditions. The division of the parts of the whole, subdivisio or decompositio, is a regress in the series of these conditions. The absolute totality of this series would be actually attained and given to the mind if the regress could arrive at simple parts. But if all the parts in a continuous decomposition are themselves divisible, the division, that is to say, the regress, proceeds from the conditioned to its conditions in infinitum, because the conditions, the parts, are themselves contained in the conditioned, and, as the latter is given in a limited intuition, the former are all given along with it. The regress cannot, therefore,
be called a regressus in indefinitum, as happened in the case of the preceding cosmological idea, the regress in which proceeded from the conditioned to the conditions not given contemporaneously and along with it, but discoverable only through the empirical regress. We are not, however, entitled to affirm of a whole of this kind, which is divisible in infinitum, that it consists of an infinite number of parts. For although all the parts are contained in the intuition of the whole division is not contained therein. The division is contained only in the progressing decomposition, in the regress itself, which is the condition of the possibility and actuality of the series. Now, as this regress is infinite, all the members, parts, to which it attains must be contained in the given whole as an aggregate. But the complete series of division is not contained therein. For this series, being infinite in succession, and always incomplete, cannot represent an infinite number of members, and still less a composition of these members into a whole. To apply this remark to space, every limited part of space presented to intuition is a whole, the parts of which are always spaces, to whatever extent subdivided. Every limited space is hence divisible to infinity. Let us again apply the remark to an external phenomenon enclosed in limits, that is, a body. The divisibility of a body rests upon the divisibility of space, which is the condition of the possibility of the body as an extended whole. A body is consequently divisible to infinity, though it does not, for that reason, consist of an infinite number of parts. It certainly seems that, as a body must be cogitated as substance in space, the law of divisibility would not be applicable to it as substance. For we may, and ought to grant, in the case of space, that division or decomposition, to any extent, never can utterly annihilate composition. That is to say, the smallest part of space must still consist of spaces. Otherwise, space would entirely cease to exist, which is impossible. But the assertion, on the other hand, that when all composition in matter is annihilated in thought, nothing remains, does not seem to harmonize with the conception of substance, which must be properly the subject of all composition, and must remain, even after the conjunction of its attributes in space, which constituted a body, is annihilated in thought. But this is not the case with substance in the phenomenal world, which is not a thing in itself cogitated by the pure category. Phenomenal substance is not an absolute subject. It is merely a permanent sensuous image, and nothing more than an intuition, in which the unconditioned is not to be found. But although this rule of progress to infinity is legitimate and applicable to the subdivision of a phenomenon, as a mere occupation or filling of space, it is not applicable to a whole, consisting of a number of distinct parts, and constituting a quantum discretum, that is to say, an organized body. It cannot be admitted that every part in an organized whole is itself organized, and that, in analyzing it to infinity, we must always meet with organized parts, although we may allow that the parts of the matter which we decompose in infinitum may be organized. For the infinity of the division of a phenomenon in space rests altogether on the fact that the divisibility of a phenomenon is given only in and through this infinity, that is, an undetermined number of parts is given, while the parts themselves are given and determined only in and through the subdivision. In a word, the infinity of the division necessarily presupposes that the whole is not already divided in se. Hence, our division determines a number of parts in the whole, a number which extends just as far as the actual regress in the division, while, on the other hand, the very notion of a body organized to infinity represents the whole as already and in itself divided. We expect, therefore, to find in it a determinate, but at the same time infinite, number of parts, which is self-contradictory. For we should thus have a whole containing a series of members which could not be completed in any regress, which is infinite, and at the same time complete in an organized composite. Infinite divisibility is applicable only to a quantum continuum, and is based entirely on the infinite divisibility of space. But in a quantum discretum, the multitude of parts or units is always determined, and hence always equal to some number. To what extent a body may be organized, experience alone can inform us. And although, so far as our experience of this or that body has extended, we may not have discovered any inorganic part, such parts must exist in possible experience. But how far the transcendental division of a phenomenon must extend, we cannot know from experience. It is a question which experience cannot answer. It is answered only by the principle of reason, which forbids us to consider the empirical regress, in the analysis of extended body, as ever absolutely complete. Concluding remark on the solution of the transcendental mathematical ideas, and introductory to the solution of the dynamical ideas. We presented the antinomy of pure reason in a tabular form, and we endeavored to show the ground of this self-contradiction on the part of reason, and the only means of bringing it to a conclusion, namely, by declaring both contradictory statements to be false. We represented in these antinomies the conditions of phenomena as belonging to the conditioned according to relations of space and time, which is the usual supposition of the common understanding. In this respect, all dialectical representations of totality in the series of conditions to a given conditioned were perfectly homogeneous. The condition was always a member of the series along with the conditioned, and thus the homogeneity of the whole series was assured. In this case, the regress could never be cogitated as complete, or, if this was the case, a member really conditioned was falsely regarded as a primal member, consequently as unconditioned. In such an antinomy, therefore, we did not consider the object, that is, the conditioned, but the series of conditions belonging to the object, and the magnitude of that series. And thus arose the difficulty, a difficulty not to be settled by any decision regarding the claims of the two parties, but simply by cutting the knot, by declaring the series proposed by reason to be either too long or too short for the understanding, which could, in neither case, make its conceptions adequate with the ideas. But we have overlooked, up to this point, an essential difference existing between the conceptions of the understanding which reason endeavors to raise to the rank of ideas. Two of these, indicating a mathematical and two a dynamical synthesis of phenomena. Hitherto, it was necessary to signalize this distinction, for, just as in our general representation of all transcendental ideas, we considered them under phenomenal conditions, so, in the two mathematical ideas, our discussion is concerned solely with an object in the world of phenomena. But as we are now about to proceed to the consideration of the dynamical conceptions of the understanding, and their adequateness with ideas, we must not lose sight of this distinction. We shall find that it opens up to us an entirely new view of the conflict in which reason is involved. For, while in the first two antinomies, both parties were dismissed on the ground of having advanced statements based upon false hypothesis, in the present case, the hope appears of discovering a hypothesis which may be consistent with the demands of reason, and the judge completing the statement of the grounds of claim, which both parties had left in an unsatisfactory state, the question may be settled on its own merits, not by dismissing the claimants, but by a comparison of the arguments on both sides. If we consider merely their extension, and whether they are adequate with ideas, the series of conditions may be regarded as all homogeneous. But the conception of the understanding which lies at the basis of these ideas contains either a synthesis of the homogeneous, presupposed in every quantity in its composition as well as in its division, or of the heterogeneous, which is the case in the dynamical synthesis of cause and effect, as well as of the necessary and the contingent. Thus, it happens that in the mathematical series of phenomena, no other than a sensuous condition is admissible, a condition which is itself a member of the series, while the dynamical series of sensuous conditions admits a heterogeneous condition, which is not a member of the series, but, as purely intelligible, lies out of and beyond it. And thus reason is satisfied, and an unconditioned placed at the head of the series of phenomena, without introducing confusion into, or discontinuing it, contrary to the principles of the understanding. Now, from the fact that the dynamical ideas admit a condition of phenomena which does not form a part of the series of phenomena, arises a result which we should not have expected from an antinomy. In former cases, the result was that both contradictory dialectical statements were declared to be false. In the present case, we find the conditioned in the dynamical series connected with an empirically unconditioned but non-sensuous condition, and thus satisfaction is done to the understanding on the one hand, and to reason on the other. Footnote: for the understanding cannot admit among phenomena a condition which is itself empirically unconditioned, but if it is possible to cogitate an intelligible condition, one which is not a member of the series of phenomena, for a conditioned phenomenon, without breaking the series of empirical conditions, such a condition may be admissible as empirically unconditioned, and the empirical regress continue regular, unceasing, and intact. Back to text. While, moreover, the dialectical arguments for unconditioned totality in mere phenomena fall to the ground, both propositions of reason may be shown to be true in their proper signification. This could not happen in the case of the cosmological ideas, which demanded a mathematically unconditioned unity. For no condition could be placed at the head of the series of phenomena, except one which was itself a phenomenon, and consequently a member of the series. and Section 9 of the empirical use of the regulative principle of reason with regard to the cosmological ideas 1 and 2. This recording is in the public domain. Section 31. The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. Part 2nd. Transcendental Logic. Second Division. Transcendental Dialectic. Book 2. Of the Dialectical Procedure of Pure Reason. Chapter 2. The Antinomy of Pure Reason. Section 9. Of the empirical use of the regulative principle of reason with regard to the cosmological ideas. 3. Solution of the cosmological idea of the totality of the deduction of cosmical events from their causes. There are only two modes of causality cogitable: the causality of nature or of freedom. The first is the conjunction of a particular state with another preceding it in the world of sense; the former following the latter by virtue of a law. Now, as the causality of phenomena is subject to conditions of time, and the preceding state, if it had always existed, could not have produced an effect which would make its first appearance at a particular time, the causality of a cause must itself be an effect, must itself have begun to be, and therefore, according to the principle of the understanding, itself requires a cause. We must understand, on the contrary, by the term freedom, in the cosmological sense, a faculty of the spontaneous origination of a state, the causality of which, therefore, is not subordinated to another cause determining it in time. Freedom is, in this sense, a pure transcendental idea, which, in the first place, contains no empirical element, the object of which, in the second place, cannot be given or determined in any experience, because it is a universal law of the very possibility of experience that everything which happens must have a cause, that, consequently, the causality of a cause, being itself something that has happened, must also have a cause. In this view of the case, the whole field of experience, how far soever it may extend, contains nothing that is not subject to the laws of nature. But, as we cannot by this means attain to an absolute totality of conditions in reference to the series of causes and effects, reason creates the idea of a spontaneity, which can begin to act of itself, and without any external cause determining it to action, according to the natural law of causality. It is especially remarkable that the practical conception of freedom is based upon the transcendental idea, and that the question of the possibility of the former is difficult only as it involves the consideration of the truth of the latter. Freedom, in the practical sense, is the independence of the will of coercion by sensuous impulses. A will is sensuous in so far as it is pathologically affected by sensuous impulses. It is termed animal, arbitrium brutum, when it is pathologically necessitated. The human will is certainly an arbitrium sensitivum, not brutum, but liberum, because sensuousness does not necessitate its action, a faculty existing in man of self-determination, independently of all sensuous coercion. It is plain that, if all causality in the world of sense were natural, and natural only, every event would be determined by another according to necessary laws, and that, consequently, phenomena, in so far as they determine the will, must necessitate every action as a natural effect from themselves. And thus all practical freedom would fall to the ground with the transcendental idea, for the latter presupposes that although a certain thing has not happened, it ought to have happened, and that, consequently, its phenomenal cause was not so powerful and determinative as to exclude the causality of our will, a causality capable of producing effects independently of, and even in opposition to, the power of natural causes, and capable, consequently, of spontaneously originating a series of events. Here, too, we find it to be the case, as we generally found in the self-contradictions and perplexities of a reason which strives to pass the bounds of possible experience, that the problem is properly not physiological but transcendental. The question of the possibility of freedom does indeed concern psychology, but, as it rests upon dialectical arguments of pure reason, its solution must engage the attention of transcendental philosophy. Before attempting this solution, a task which transcendental philosophy cannot decline, it will be advisable to make a remark with regard to its procedure in the settlement of the question. If phenomena were things in themselves, and time and space forms of the existence of things, condition and conditioned would always be members of the same series, and thus would arise in the present case the antinomy common to all transcendental ideas, that their series is either too great or too small for the understanding. The dynamical ideas, which we are about to discuss in this and the following section, possess the peculiarity of relating to an object not considered as a quantity, but as an existence, and thus, in the discussion of the present question, we may make abstraction of the quantity of the series of conditions, and consider merely the dynamical relation of the condition to the conditioned. The question, then, suggests itself whether freedom is possible, and, if it is, whether it can consist with the universality of the natural law of causality, and consequently, whether we enounce a proper disjunctive proposition when we say, every effect must have its origin either in nature or in freedom, or whether both cannot exist together in the same event in different relations. The principle of an unbroken connection between all events in the phenomenal world, in accordance with the unchangeable laws of nature, is a well-established principle of transcendental analytic, which admits of no exception. The question, therefore, is, whether an effect determined according to the laws of nature can at the same time be produced by a free agent, or whether freedom and nature mutually exclude each other. And here, the common but fallacious hypothesis of the absolute reality of phenomena manifests its injurious influence in embarrassing the procedure of reason. For if phenomena are things in themselves, freedom is impossible. In this case, nature is the complete and all-sufficient cause of every event, and condition and conditioned, cause and effect, are contained in the same series, and necessitated by the same law. If, on the contrary, phenomena are held to be, as they are in fact, nothing more than mere representations, connected with each other in accordance with empirical laws, they must have a ground which is not phenomenal. But the causality of such an intelligible cause is not determined or determinable by phenomena, although its effects, as phenomena, must be determined by other phenomenal existences. This cause and its causality exist, therefore, out of and apart from the series of phenomena, while its effects do exist and are discoverable in the series of empirical conditions. Such an effect may therefore be considered to be free in relation to its intelligible cause, and necessary in relation to the phenomena from which it is a necessary consequence, a distinction which, stated in this perfectly general and abstract manner, must appear in the highest degree subtle and obscure. The sequel will explain. It is sufficient at present to remark that, as the complete and unbroken connection of phenomena is an unalterable law of nature, freedom is impossible, on the supposition that phenomena are absolutely real. Hence, those philosophers who adhere to the common opinion on this subject can never succeed in reconciling the ideas of nature and freedom. Possibility of freedom in harmony with the universal law of natural necessity. That element in a sensuous object which is not itself sensuous, I may be allowed to term intelligible. If, accordingly, an object which must be regarded as a sensuous phenomenon possesses a faculty which is not an object of sensuous intuition, but by means of which it is capable of being the cause of phenomena, the causality of an object or existence of this kind may be regarded from two different points of view. It may be considered to be intelligible as regards its action, the action of a thing which is a thing in itself, and sensuous as regards its effects, the effects of a phenomenon belonging to the sensuous world. We should, accordingly, have to form both an empirical and an intellectual conception of the causality of such a faculty or power, both, however, having reference to the same effect. This twofold manner of cogitating a power residing in a sensuous object does not run counter to any of the conceptions which we ought to form of the world of phenomena, or of a possible experience. Phenomena, not being things in themselves, must have a transcendental object as a foundation, which determines them as mere representations, and there seems to be no reason why we should not ascribe to this transcendental object, in addition to the property of self-phenomenization, a causality whose effects are to be met with in the world of phenomena, although it is not itself a phenomenon. But every effective cause must possess a character, that is to say, a law of its causality, without which it would cease to be a cause. In the above case, then, every sensuous object would possess an empirical character, which guaranteed that its actions, as phenomena, stand in complete and harmonious connection, conformably to unvarying natural laws, with all other phenomena, and can be deduced from these as conditions, and that they do thus, in connection with these, constitute a series in the order of nature. This sensuous object must, in the second place, possess an intelligible character, which guarantees it to be the cause of those actions as phenomena, although it is not itself a phenomenon nor subordinate to the conditions of the world of sense. The former may be termed the character of the thing as a phenomenon, the latter the character of the thing as a thing in itself. Now this active subject would, in its character of intelligible subject, be subordinate to no conditions of time, for time is only a condition of phenomena, and not of things in themselves. No action would begin or cease to be in this subject. It would consequently be free from the law of all determination of time, the law of change, namely, that everything which happens must have a cause in the phenomena of a preceding state. In one word, the causality of the subject, in so far as it is intelligible, would not form part of the series of empirical conditions which determine and necessitate an event in the world of sense. Again, this intelligible character of a thing cannot be immediately cognized, because we can perceive nothing but phenomena. But it must be capable of being cogitated in harmony with the empirical character, for we always find ourselves compelled to place, in thought, a transcendental object at the basis of phenomena, although we can never know what this object is in itself. In virtue of its empirical character, this subject would at the same time be subordinate to all the empirical laws of causality, and, as a phenomenon and member of the sensuous world, its effects would have to be accounted for by a reference to preceding phenomena. Eternal phenomena must be capable of influencing it, and its actions, in accordance with natural laws, must explain to us how its empirical character, that is, the law of its causality, is to be cognized in and by means of experience. In a word, all requisites for a complete and necessary determination of these actions must be presented to us by experience. In virtue of its intelligible character, on the other hand, although we possess only a general conception of this character, the subject must be regarded as free from all sensuous influences and from all phenomenal determination. Moreover, as nothing happens in this subject, for it is a noumenon, and there does not consequently exist in it any change demanding the dynamical determination of time, and for the same reason, no connection with phenomena as causes, this active existence must in its actions be free from and independent of natural necessity. For this necessity exists only in the world of phenomena. It would be quite correct to say that it originates or begins its effects in the world of sense from itself, although the action productive of these effects does not begin in itself. We should not be in this case affirming that these sensuous effects began to exist of themselves, because they are always determined by prior empirical conditions, by virtue of the empirical character, which is the phenomenon of the intelligible character, and are possible only as constituting a continuation of the series of natural causes. And thus, nature and freedom, each in the complete and absolute signification of these terms, can exist without contradiction or disagreement in the same action. Exposition of the cosmological idea of freedom in harmony with the universal law of natural necessity. I have thought it advisable to lay before the reader at first merely a sketch of the solution of this transcendental problem, in order to enable him to form, with greater ease, a clear conception of the course which reason must adopt in the solution. I shall now proceed to exhibit the several momenta of this solution, and to consider them in their order. The natural law that everything which happens must have a cause, that the causality of this cause, that is, the action of the cause, which cannot always have existed, but must be itself an event, for it precedes in time some effect which it has originated, must have itself a phenomenal cause by which it is determined, and consequently all events are empirically determined in an order of nature. This law, I say, which lies at the foundation of the possibility of experience, and of a connected system of phenomena or nature, is a law of the understanding, from which no departure, and to which no exception, can be admitted. For to accept even a single phenomenon from its operation is to exclude it from the sphere of possible experience, and thus to admit it to be a mere fiction of thought, or phantom of the brain. Thus we are obliged to acknowledge the existence of a chain of causes, in which, however, absolute totality cannot be found. But we need not detain ourselves with this question, for it has already been sufficiently answered in our discussion of the antinomies into which reason falls, when it attempts to reach the unconditioned in the series of phenomena. If we permit ourselves to be deceived by the illusion of transcendental idealism, we shall find that neither nature nor freedom exists. Now the question is, whether, admitting the existence of natural necessity in the world of phenomena, it is possible to consider an effect as, at the same time, an effect of nature and an effect of freedom, or whether these two modes of causality are contradictory and incompatible. No phenomenal cause can absolutely and of itself begin a series. Every action, in so far as it is productive of an event, is itself an event or occurrence, and presupposes another state in which its cause existed. Thus, everything that happens is but a continuation of a series, and an absolute beginning is impossible in the sensuous world. The actions of natural causes are, accordingly, themselves effects, and presuppose causes preceding them in time. A primal action which forms an absolute beginning is beyond the causal power of phenomena. Now, is it absolutely necessary that, granting that all effects are phenomena, the causality of the cause of these effects must also be a phenomenon and belong to the empirical world? Is it not rather possible that, although every effect in the phenomenal world must be connected with an empirical cause according to the universal law of nature, this empirical causality may be itself the effect of a non-empirical and intelligible causality, its connection with natural causes remaining, nevertheless, intact? Such a causality would be considered in reference to phenomena as the primal action of a cause, which is in so far therefore not phenomenal, but by reason of this faculty or power intelligible, although it must at the same time, as a link in the chain of nature, be regarded as belonging to the sensuous world. A belief in the reciprocal causality of phenomena is necessary if we are required to look for and to present the natural conditions of natural events, that is to say, their causes. This being admitted as unexceptionably valid, the requirements of the understanding, which recognizes nothing but nature in the region of phenomena, are satisfied, and our physical explanations of physical phenomena may proceed in their regular course, without hindrance and without opposition. But it is no stumbling block in the way, even assuming the idea to be of pure fiction, to admit that there are some natural causes in the possession of a faculty which is not empirical but intelligible, inasmuch as it is not determined to action by empirical conditions, but purely and solely upon grounds brought forward by the understanding, this action being still, when the cause is phenomenized, in perfect accordance with the laws of empirical causality. Thus, the acting subject, as a causal phenomenon, would continue to preserve a complete connection with nature and natural conditions, and the phenomenon only of the subject, with all its phenomenal causality, would contain certain conditions which, if we ascend from the empirical to the transcendental object, must necessarily be regarded as intelligible. For, if we attend, in our inquiries with regard to causes in the world of phenomena, to the directions of nature alone, we need not trouble ourselves about the relation in which the transcendental subject, which is completely unknown to us, stands to these phenomena and their connection in nature. The intelligible ground of phenomena in this subject does not concern empirical questions. It has to do only with pure thought, and although the effects of this thought and action of the pure understanding are discoverable in phenomena, these phenomena must nevertheless be capable of a full and complete explanation, upon purely physical grounds, and in accordance with natural laws. And in this case, we attend solely to their empirical, and omit all consideration of their intelligible character, which is the transcendental cause of the former, as completely unknown, except in so far as it is exhibited by the latter as its empirical symbol. Now let us apply this to experience. Man is a phenomenon of the sensuous world, and at the same time, therefore, a natural cause, the causality of which must be regulated by empirical laws. As such, he must possess an empirical character like all other natural phenomena. We remark this empirical character in his actions, which reveal the presence of certain powers and faculties. If we consider inanimate or merely animal nature, we can discover no reason for ascribing to ourselves any other than a faculty which is determined in a purely sensuous manner. But man, to whom nature reveals herself only through sense, cognizes himself not only by his senses, but also through pure apperception, and this in actions and internal determinations which he cannot regard as sensuous impressions. He is thus to himself, on the one hand, a phenomenon, but on the other hand, in respect of certain faculties, a purely intelligible object. Intelligible because its action cannot be ascribed to sensuous receptivity. These faculties are understanding and reason. The latter, especially, is in a peculiar manner distinct from all empirically conditioned faculties, for it employs ideas alone in the consideration of its objects, and by means of these determines the understanding, which then proceeds to make an empirical use of its own conceptions, which, like the ideas of reason, are pure and non-empirical. That reason possesses the faculty of causality, or that, at least, we are compelled so to represent it, is evident from the imperatives which, in the sphere of the practical, we impose on many of our executive powers. The words "I ought" express a species of necessity and imply a connection with grounds which nature does not and cannot present to the mind of man. Understanding knows nothing in nature but that which is, or has been, or will be. It would be absurd to say that anything in nature ought to be other than it is in the relations of time in which it stands. Indeed, the ought, when we consider merely the course of nature, has neither application nor meaning. The question, what ought to happen in the sphere of nature, is just as absurd as the question, what ought to be the properties of a circle? All that we are entitled to ask is, what takes place in nature, or, in the latter case, what are the properties of a circle? But the idea of an ought or of duty indicates a possible action, the ground of which is a pure conception, while the ground of a merely natural action is, on the contrary, always a phenomenon. This action must certainly be possible under physical conditions, if it is prescribed by the moral imperative ought. But these physical or natural conditions do not concern the determination of the will itself. They relate to its effect alone, and the consequences of the effect in the world of phenomena. Whatever number of motives nature may present to my will, whatever sensuous impulses, the moral ought, it is beyond their power to produce. They may produce a volition which, so far from being necessary, is always conditioned, a volition to which the ought enunciated by reason sets an aim and a standard, gives permission or prohibition. Be the object what it may, purely sensuous, as pleasure, or presented by pure reason, as good, reason will not yield to grounds which have an empirical origin. Reason will not follow the order of things presented by experience, but, with perfect spontaneity, rearranges them according to ideas, with which it compels empirical conditions to agree. It declares, in the name of these ideas, certain actions to be necessary which nevertheless have not taken place, and which perhaps never will take place, and yet presupposes that it possesses the faculty of causality in relation to these actions, for, in the absence of this supposition, it could not expect its ideas to produce certain effects in the world of experience. Now, let us stop here, and admit it to be at least possible that reason does stand in a really causal relation to phenomena. In this case, it must, pure reason as it is, exhibit an empirical character. For every cause presupposes a rule according to which certain phenomena follow as effects from the cause, and every rule requires uniformity in these effects, and this is the proper ground of the conception of a cause as a faculty or power. Now, this conception of a cause may be termed the empirical character of reason, and this character is a permanent one, while the effects produced appear, in conformity with the various conditions which accompany and partly limit them, in various forms. Thus, the volition of every man has an empirical character, which is nothing more than the causality of his reason in so far as its effects in the phenomenal world manifest the presence of a rule according to which we are enabled to examine, in their several kinds and degrees, the actions of this causality and the rational grounds for these actions, and, in this way, to decide upon the subjective principles of the volition. Now, we learn what this empirical character is only from phenomenal effects, and from the rule of these which is presented by experience. And for this reason, all the actions of man in the world of phenomena are determined by his empirical character, and the cooperative causes of nature. If, then, we could investigate all the phenomena of human volition to their lowest foundation in the mind, there would be no action which we could not anticipate with certainty, and recognize to be absolutely necessary from its preceding conditions. So far as relates to this empirical character, therefore, there can be no freedom, and it is only in the light of this character that we can consider the human will, when we confine ourselves to simple observation and, as is the case in anthropology, institute a physiological investigation of the motive causes of human actions. But when we consider the same actions in relation to reason, not for the purpose of explaining their origin, that is, in relation to speculative reason, but to practical reason, as the producing cause of these actions, we shall discover a rule and an order very different from those of nature and experience. For the declaration of this mental faculty may be that what has and could not but take place in the course of nature, ought not to have taken place. Sometimes, too, we discover, or believe that we discover, that the ideas of reason did actually stand in a causal relation to certain actions of man, and that these actions have taken place because they were determined not by empirical causes, but by the act of the will upon grounds of reason. Now, granting that reason stands in a causal relation to phenomena, can an action of reason be called free when we know that, sensuously, in its empirical character, it is completely determined and absolutely necessary? But this empirical character is itself determined by the intelligible character. The latter we cannot cognize, we can only indicate it by means of phenomena, which enable us to have an immediate cognition only of the empirical character. Footnote. The real morality of actions, their merit or demerit, and even that of our own conduct, is completely unknown to us. Our estimates can relate only to their empirical character. How much is the result of the action of free will, how much is to be ascribed to nature and to blameless error, or to a happy constitution of temperament, merito fortunae, no one can discover, nor, for this reason, determine with perfect justice. Back to text. An action, then, in so far as it is to be ascribed to an intelligible cause, does not result from it in accordance with empirical laws. That is to say, not the conditions of pure reason, but only their effects in the internal sense, precede the act. Pure reason, as a purely intelligible faculty, is not subject to the conditions of time. The causality of reason in its intelligible character does not begin to be. It does not make its appearance at a certain time for the purpose of producing an effect. If this were not the case, the causality of reason would be subservient to the natural law of phenomena, which determines them according to time, and as a series of causes and effects in time. It would consequently cease to be freedom and become a part of nature. We are therefore justified in saying, if reason stands in a causal relation to phenomena, it is a faculty which originates the sensuous condition of an empirical series of effects. For the condition, which resides in the reason, is non-sensuous, and therefore cannot be originated or begin to be. And thus we find, what we could not discover in any empirical series, a condition of successive series of events in itself empirically unconditioned. For in the present case, the condition stands out of and beyond the series of phenomena. It is intelligible, and it consequently cannot be subjected to any sensuous condition, or to any time determination by a preceding cause. But, in another respect, the same cause belongs also to the series of phenomena. Man is himself a phenomenon. His will has an empirical character, which is the empirical cause of all his actions. There is no condition determining man and his volition in conformity with this character, which does not itself form part of the series of effects in nature and is subject to their law, the law according to which an empirically undetermined cause of an event in time cannot exist. For this reason, no given action can have an absolute and spontaneous origination, all actions being phenomena and belonging to the world of experience. But it cannot be said of reason that the state in which it determines the will is always preceded by some other state determining it. For reason is not a phenomenon, and therefore not subject to sensuous conditions, and consequently, even in relation to its causality, the sequence or conditions of time do not influence reason, nor can the dynamical law of nature, which determines the sequence of time according to certain rules, be applied to it. Reason is consequently the permanent condition of all actions of the human will. Each of these is determined in the empirical character of the man, even before it has taken place. The intelligible character, of which the former is but the sensuous schema, knows no before or after, and every action, irrespective of the time relation in which it stands with other phenomena, is the immediate effect of the intelligible character of pure reason, which, consequently, enjoys freedom of action, and is not dynamically determined either by internal or external preceding conditions. This freedom must not be described in a purely negative manner as independence of empirical conditions, for in this case the faculty of reason would cease to be a cause of phenomena, but it must be regarded positively as a faculty which can spontaneously originate a series of events. At the same time, it must not be supposed that any beginning can take place in reason. On the contrary, reason, as the unconditioned condition of all action of the will, admits of no time conditions, although its effect does really begin in a series of phenomena, a beginning which is not, however, absolutely primal. I shall illustrate this regulative principle of reason by an example from its employment in the world of experience. Proved it cannot be by any amount of experience, or by any number of facts, for such arguments cannot establish the truth of transcendental propositions. Let us take a voluntary action, for example, a falsehood, by means of which a man has introduced a certain degree of confusion into the social life of humanity, which is judged according to the motives from which it originated, and the blame of which, and of the evil consequences arising from it, is imputed to the offender. We at first proceed to examine the empirical character of the offense, and for this purpose we endeavor to penetrate to the sources of that character, such as a defective education, bad company, a shameless and wicked disposition, frivolity, and want of reflection, not forgetting also the occasioning causes which prevailed at the moment of the transgression. In this, the procedure is exactly the same as that pursued in the investigation of the series of causes which determine a given physical effect. Now, although we believe the action to have been determined by all these circumstances, we do not the less blame the offender. We do not blame him for his unhappy disposition, nor for the circumstances which influenced him, nay, not even for his former course of life, for we presuppose that all these considerations may be set aside, that the series of preceding conditions may be regarded as having never existed, and that the action may be considered as completely unconditioned in relation to any state preceding, just as if the agent commenced with it an entirely new series of effects. Our blame of the offender is grounded upon a law of reason which requires us to regard this faculty as a cause, which could have and ought to have otherwise determined the behavior of the culprit, independently of all empirical conditions. This causality of reason we do not regard as a co-operating agency, but as complete in itself. It matters not whether the sensuous impulses favored or opposed the action of this causality. The offense is estimated according to its intelligible character. The offender is decidedly worthy of blame the moment he utters a falsehood. It follows that we regard reason, in spite of the empirical conditions of the act, as completely free, and therefore, as in the present case, culpable. The above judgment is complete evidence that we are accustomed to think that reason is not affected by sensuous conditions, that in it no change takes place, although its phenomena, in other words, the mode in which it appears in its effects, are subject to change, that in it no preceding state determines the following, and, consequently, that it does not form a member of the series of sensuous conditions which necessitate phenomena according to natural laws. Reason is present and the same in all human actions and at all times, but it does not itself exist in time, and therefore does not enter upon any state in which it did not formerly exist. It is, relatively to new states or conditions, determining, but not determinable. Hence, we cannot ask, why did not reason determine itself in a different manner? The question ought to be thus stated: why did not reason employ its power of causality to determine certain phenomena in a different manner? But this is a question which admits of no answer, for a different intelligible character would have exhibited a different empirical character. And when we say that, in spite of the course which his whole former life had taken, the offender could have refrained from uttering the falsehood, this means merely that the act was subject to the power and authority, permissive or prohibitive, of reason. Now, reason is not subject in its causality to any conditions of phenomena or of time, and a difference in time may produce a difference in the relation of phenomena to each other, for these are not things, and therefore not causes in themselves. But it cannot produce any difference in the relation in which the action stands to the faculty of reason. Thus, then, in our investigation into free actions and the causal power which produced them, we arrive at an intelligible cause, beyond which, however, we cannot go. Although we can recognize that it is free, that is, independent of all sensuous conditions, and that, in this way, it may be the sensuously unconditioned condition of phenomena. But for what reason the intelligible character generates such and such phenomena, and exhibits such and such an empirical character under certain circumstances, it is beyond the power of our reason to decide. The question is as much above the power and the sphere of reason as the following would be: why does the transcendental object of our external sensuous intuition allow of no other form than that of intuition in space? But the problem, which we were called upon to solve, does not require us to entertain any such questions. The problem was merely this: whether freedom and natural necessity can exist without opposition in the same action. To this question we have given a sufficient answer, for we have shown that, as the former stands in a relation to a different kind of condition from those of the latter, the law of the one does not affect the law of the other, and that, consequently, both can exist together in independence of and without interference with each other. The reader must be careful to remark that my intention in the above remarks has not been to prove the actual existence of freedom as a faculty in which resides the cause of certain sensuous phenomena. For, not to mention that such an argument would not have a transcendental character, nor have been limited to the discussion of pure conceptions, all attempts at inferring from experience what cannot be cogitated in accordance with its laws must ever be unsuccessful. Nay, more, I have not even aimed at demonstrating the possibility of freedom, for this too would have been a vain endeavor, inasmuch as it is beyond the power of the mind to cognize the possibility of a reality or of a causal power by the aid of mere a priori conceptions. Freedom has been considered in the foregoing remarks only as a transcendental idea, by means of which reason aims at originating a series of conditions in the world of phenomena with the help of that which is sensuously unconditioned, involving itself, however, in an antinomy with the laws which itself prescribes for the conduct of the understanding. That this antinomy is based upon a mere illusion, and that nature and freedom are at least not opposed, this was the only thing in our power to prove, and the question which it was our task to solve. End 3. Solution of the cosmological ideas of the totality of the deduction of cosmical events from their causes. This recording is in the public domain. Section 32. The Critique of Pure Reason, by Immanuel Kant. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. Part 2nd. Transcendental Logic. Second Division. Transcendental Dialectic. Book 2. Of the Dialectical Procedure of Pure Reason. Chapter 2. The Antinomy of Pure Reason. Section 9. Of the empirical use of the regulative principle of reason with regard to the cosmological ideas. 4. Solution of the cosmological idea of the totality of the dependence of phenomenal existences. And concluding remarks on the antinomy of pure reason. In the preceding remarks, we considered the changes in the world of sense as constituting a dynamical series, in which each member is subordinated to another as its cause. Our present purpose is to avail ourselves of this series of states or conditions as a guide to an existence which may be the highest condition of all changeable phenomena, that is, to a necessary being. Our endeavor to reach, not the unconditioned causality, but the unconditioned existence of substance. The series before us is therefore a series of conceptions, and not of intuitions, in which the one intuition is the condition of the other. But it is evident that, as all phenomena are subject to change and conditioned in their existence, the series of dependent existences cannot embrace an unconditioned member, the existence of which would be absolutely necessary. It follows that, if phenomena were things in themselves, and, as an immediate consequence from this supposition, condition and conditioned belonged to the same series of phenomena, the existence of a necessary being, as the condition of the existence of sensuous phenomena, would be perfectly impossible. An important distinction, however, exists between the dynamical and the mathematical regress. The latter is engaged solely with the combination of parts into a whole, or with the division of a whole into its parts,
and therefore are the conditions of its series parts of the series, and to be consequently regarded as homogeneous, and for this reason as consisting, without exception, of phenomena. In the former regress, on the contrary, the aim of which is not to establish the possibility of an unconditioned whole consisting of given parts, or of an unconditioned part of a given whole, but to demonstrate the possibility of the deduction of a certain state from its cause, or of the contingent existence of substance from that which exists necessarily, it is not requisite that the condition should form part of an empirical series along with the conditioned. In the case of the apparent antinomy with which we are at present dealing, there exists a way of escape from the difficulty, for it is not impossible that both of the contradictory statements may be true in different relations. All sensuous phenomena may be contingent, and consequently possess only an empirically conditioned existence, and yet there may also exist a non-empirical condition of the whole series, or, in other words, a necessary being. For this necessary being, as an intelligible condition, would not form a member, not even the highest member, of the series. The whole world of sense would be left in its empirically determined existence uninterfered with and uninfluenced. This would also form a ground of distinction between the modes of solution employed for the third and fourth antinomies. For, while in the consideration of freedom in the former antinomy, the thing itself, the cause, substantia phenomenon, was regarded as belonging to the series of conditions, and only its causality to the intelligible world, we are obliged in the present case to cogitate this necessary being as purely intelligible, and as existing entirely apart from the world of sense, as an ens extramundanum, for otherwise it would be subject to the phenomenal law of contingency and dependence. In relation to the present problem, therefore, the regulative principle of reason is that everything in the sensuous world possesses an empirically conditioned existence, that no property of the sensuous world possesses unconditioned necessity, that we are bound to expect, and, so far as is possible, to seek for the empirical condition of every member in the series of conditions, and that there is no sufficient reason to justify us in deducing any existence from a condition which lies out of and beyond the empirical series, or in regarding any existence as independent and self-subsistent, although this should not prevent us from recognizing the possibility of the whole series being based upon a being which is intelligible, and for this reason free from all empirical conditions. But it has been far from my intention in these remarks to prove the existence of this unconditioned and necessary being, or even to evidence the possibility of a purely intelligible condition of the existence of all sensuous phenomena. As bounds were set to reason, to prevent it from leaving the guiding thread of empirical conditions and losing itself in transcendent theories which are incapable of concrete presentation, so it was my purpose, on the other hand, to set bounds to the law of the purely empirical understanding, and to protest against any attempts on its part at deciding on the possibility of things, or declaring the existence of the intelligible to be impossible, merely on the ground that it is not available for the explanation and exposition of phenomena. It has been shown, at the same time, that the contingency of all the phenomena of nature and their empirical conditions is quite consistent with the arbitrary hypothesis of a necessary, although purely intelligible condition, that no real contradiction exists between them, and that, consequently, both may be true. The existence of such an absolutely necessary being may be impossible, But this can never be demonstrated from the universal contingency and dependence of sensuous phenomena, nor from the principle which forbids us to discontinue the series at some member of it, or to seek for its cause in some sphere of existence beyond the world of nature. Reason goes its way in the empirical world, and follows, too, its peculiar path in the sphere of the transcendental. The sensuous world contains nothing but phenomena which are mere representations and always sensuously conditioned. Things in themselves are not, and cannot be, objects to us. It is not to be wondered at, therefore, that we are not justified in leaping from some member of an empirical series beyond the world of sense, as if empirical representations were things in themselves, existing apart from their transcendental ground in the human mind, and the cause of whose existence may be sought out of the empirical series. This would certainly be the case with contingent things, but it cannot be with mere representations of things, the contingency of which is itself merely a phenomenon, and can relate to no other regress than that which determines phenomena, that is, the empirical. But to cogitate an intelligible ground of phenomena as free, moreover, from the contingency of the latter, conflicts neither with the unlimited nature of the empirical regress, nor with the complete contingency of phenomena. And the demonstration of this was the only thing necessary for the solution of this apparent antinomy. For, if the condition of every conditioned, as regards its existence, is sensuous, and for this reason a part of the same series, it must be itself conditioned, as was shown in the antithesis of the fourth antinomy. The embarrassments into which a reason which postulates the unconditioned necessarily falls must therefore continue to exist, or the unconditioned must be placed in the sphere of the intelligible. In this way, its necessity does not require, nor does it even permit, the presence of an empirical condition, and it is, consequently, unconditionally necessary. The empirical employment of reason is not affected by the assumption of a purely intelligible being. It continues its operations on the principle of the contingency of all phenomena, proceeding from empirical conditions to still higher and higher conditions, themselves empirical. Just as little does this regulative principle exclude the assumption of an intelligible cause, when the question regards merely the pure employment of reason in relation to ends or aims. For, in this case, an intelligible cause signifies merely the transcendental and, to us unknown, ground of the possibility of sensuous phenomena, and its existence, necessary and independent of all sensuous conditions, is not inconsistent with the contingency of phenomena, or with the unlimited possibility of regress which exists in the series of empirical conditions. Concluding remarks on the antinomy of pure reason. So long as the object of our rational conceptions is the totality of conditions in the world of phenomena, and the satisfaction, from this source, of the requirements of reason, so long are our ideas transcendental and cosmological. But when we set the unconditioned, which is the aim of all our inquiries, in a sphere which lies out of the world of sense and possible experience, our ideas become transcendent. They are then not merely serviceable towards the completion of the exercise of reason, which remains an idea, never executed, but always to be pursued. They detach themselves completely from experience, and construct for themselves objects, the material of which has not been presented by experience, and the objective reality of which is not based upon the completion of the empirical series, but upon pure a priori conceptions. The intelligible object of these transcendent ideas may be conceded, as a transcendental object, but we cannot cogitate it as a thing determinable by certain distinct predicates relating to its internal nature, for it has no connection with empirical conceptions, nor are we justified in affirming the existence of any such object. It is, consequently, a mere product of the mind alone. Of all the cosmological ideas, however, it is that occasioning the fourth antinomy which compels us to venture upon this step. For the existence of phenomena, always conditioned and never self-subsistent, requires us to look for an object different from phenomena, an intelligible object, with which all contingency must cease. But, as we have allowed ourselves to assume the existence of a self-subsistent reality out of the field of experience, and are therefore obliged to regard phenomena as merely a contingent mode of representing intelligible objects employed by beings which are themselves intelligences, no other course remains for us than to follow analogy and employ the same mode in forming some conception of intelligible things, of which we have the least knowledge, which nature taught us to use in the formation of empirical conceptions. Experience made us acquainted with the contingent, but we are at present engaged in the discussion of things which are not objects of experience, and must, therefore, deduce our knowledge of them from that which is necessary absolutely and in itself, that is, from pure conceptions. Hence, the first step which we take out of the world of sense obliges us to begin our system of new cognition with the investigation of a necessary being, and to deduce from our conceptions of it all our conceptions of intelligible things. This we propose to attempt in the following chapter. End Chapter 2 of the deduction of the pure conceptions of the understanding. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 33 of the Critique of Pure Reason.
The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. Part 2nd. Transcendental Logic. Second Division. Transcendental Dialectic. Book 2. Of the Dialectical Procedure of Pure Reason. Chapter 3. The Ideal of Pure Reason. Sections 1 and 2.
Section 1. Of the Ideal in general. We have seen that pure conceptions do not present objects to the mind, except under sensuous conditions, because the conditions of objective reality do not exist in these conceptions, which contain, in fact, nothing but the mere form of thought. They may, however, when applied to phenomena, be presented in concreto, for it is phenomena that present to them the materials for the formation of empirical conceptions, which are nothing more than concrete forms of the conceptions of the understanding. But ideas are still further removed from objective reality than categories, for no phenomenon can ever present them to the human mind in concreto. They contain a certain perfection, attainable by no possible empirical cognition, and they give to reason a systematic unity, to which the unity of experience attempts to approximate, but can never completely attain. But still further removed than the idea from objective reality is the ideal, by which term I understand the idea, not in concreto but in individuo, as an individual thing, determinable or determined by the idea alone. The idea of humanity in its complete perfection supposes not only the advancement of all the powers and faculties which constitute our conception of human nature to a complete attainment of their final aims, but also everything which is requisite for the complete determination of the idea. For of all contradictory predicates, only one can conform with the idea of the perfect man. What I have termed an ideal was in Plato's philosophy an idea of the divine mind, an individual object present to its pure intuition, the most perfect of every kind of possible beings, and the archetype of all phenomenal existences. Without rising to these speculative heights, we are bound to confess that human reason contains not only ideas, but ideals, which possess, not like those of Plato, creative but certainly practical power, as regulative principles, and form the basis of the perfectibility of certain actions. Moral conceptions are not perfectly pure conceptions of reason, because an empirical element, of pleasure or pain, lies at the foundation of them. In relation, however, to the principle, whereby reason sets bounds to a freedom which is in itself without law, and consequently, when we attend merely to their form, they may be considered as pure conceptions of reason. Virtue and wisdom in their perfect purity are ideas. But the wise man of the Stoics is an ideal, that is to say, a human being existing only in thought and in complete conformity with the idea of wisdom. As the idea provides a rule, so the ideal serves as an archetype for the perfect and complete determination of the copy. Thus the conduct of this wise and divine man serves us as a standard of action, with which we may compare and judge ourselves, which may help us to reform ourselves, although the perfection it demands can never be attained by us. Although we cannot concede objective reality to these ideals, they are not to be considered as chimeras. On the contrary, they provide reason with a standard, which enables it to estimate, by comparison, the degree of incompleteness in the objects presented to it. But to aim at realizing the ideal in an example in the world of experience, to describe, for instance, the character of the perfectly wise man in a romance, is impracticable. Nay, more, there is something absurd in the attempt, and the result must be little edifying, as the natural limitations, which are continually breaking in upon the perfection and completeness of the idea, destroy the illusion in the story, and throw an air of suspicion even on what is good in the idea, which hence appears fictitious and unreal. Such is the constitution of the ideal of reason, which is always based upon determinate conceptions, and serves as a rule and a model for limitation or of criticism. Very different is the nature of the ideals of the imagination. Of these it is impossible to present an intelligible conception. They are a kind of monogram, drawn according to no determinate rule, and forming rather a vague picture, the production of many diverse experiences, than a determinate image. Such are the ideals which painters and physiognomists profess to have in their minds, and which can serve neither as a model for production nor as a standard for appreciation. They may be termed, though improperly, sensuous ideals, as they are declared to be models of certain possible empirical intuitions. They cannot, however, furnish rules or standards for explanation or examination. In its ideals, reason aims at complete and perfect determination according to a priori rules, and hence it cogitates an object which must be completely determinable in conformity with principles, although all empirical conditions are absent, and the conception of the object is on this account transcendent. Section 2. Of the Transcendental Ideal. Prototypon transcendentale. Every conception is, in relation to that which is not contained in it, undetermined and subject to the principle of determinability. This principle is that, of every two contradictorily opposed predicates, only one can belong to a conception. It is a purely logical principle, itself based upon the principle of contradiction, inasmuch as it makes complete abstraction of the content and attends merely to the logical form of the cognition. But again, everything, as regards its possibility, is also subject to the principle of complete determination, according to which one of all the possible contradictory predicates of things must belong to it. This principle is not based merely upon that of contradiction, for, in addition to the relation between two contradictory predicates, it regards everything as standing in a relation to the sum of possibilities, as the sum total of all predicates of things, and, while presupposing this sum as an a priori condition, presents to the mind everything as receiving the possibility of its individual existence from the relation it bears to, and the share it possesses in, the aforesaid sum of possibilities. Footnote 64. Thus this principle declares everything to possess a relation to a common correlate, the sum total of possibility, which, if discovered to exist in the idea of one individual thing, would establish the affinity of all possible things, from the identity of the ground of their complete determination. The determinability of every conception is subordinate to the universality, Allgemeinheit Universalitas, of the principle of excluded middle, the determination of a thing to the totality, Allheit Universitas, of all possible predicates. End footnote. The principle of complete determination relates to the content and not to the logical form. It is the principle of the synthesis of all the predicates which are required to constitute the complete conception of a thing, and not a mere principal analytical representation, which announces that one of two contradictory predicates must belong to a conception. It contains, moreover, a transcendental presupposition, that, namely, of the material for all possibility, which must contain a priori the data for this or that particular possibility. The proposition, everything which exists is completely determined, means not only that one of every pair of given contradictory attributes, but that one of all possible attributes, is always predicable of the thing. In it the predicates are not merely compared logically with each other, but the thing itself is transcendentally compared with the sum total of all possible predicates. The proposition is equivalent to saying, to attain to a complete knowledge of a thing, it is necessary to possess a knowledge of everything that is possible, and to determine it thereby in a positive or negative manner. The conception of complete determination is consequently a conception which cannot be presented in its totality in concreto, and is therefore based upon an idea, which has its seat in the reason, the faculty which prescribes to the understanding the laws of its harmonious and perfect exercise. Now, although this idea of the sum total of all possibility, in so far as it forms the condition of the complete determination of everything, is itself undetermined in relation to the predicates which may constitute this sum total, and we cogitate in it merely the sum total of all possible predicates. We nevertheless find, upon closer examination, that this idea, as a primitive conception of the mind, excludes a large number of predicates, those deduced and those irreconcilable with others, and that it is evolved as a conception completely determined a priori. Thus it becomes the conception of an individual object, which is completely determined by and through the mere idea, and must consequently be termed an ideal of pure reason. When we consider all possible predicates, not merely logically but transcendentally, that is to say, with reference to the content which may be cogitated as existing in them a priori, we shall find that some indicate a being, others merely a non-being. The logical negation expressed in the word not does not properly belong to a conception, but only to the relation of one conception to another in a judgment, and is consequently quite insufficient to present to the mind the content of a conception. The expression not mortal does not indicate that a non-being is cogitated in the object. It does not concern the content at all. A transcendental negation, on the contrary, indicates non-being in itself, and is opposed to transcendental affirmation, the conception of which of itself expresses a being. Hence, this affirmation indicates a reality, because in and through it objects are considered to be something, to be things, while the opposite negation, on the other hand, indicates a mere want, or privation, or absence, and, where such negations alone are attached to a representation, the non-existence of anything corresponding to the representation. Now, a negation cannot be cogitated as determined, without cogitating at the same time the opposite affirmation. The man born blind has not the least notion of darkness, because he has none of the light. The vagabond knows nothing of poverty, because he has never known what it is to be in comfort. Footnote 65. The investigations and calculations of astronomers have taught us much that is wonderful, but the most important lesson we have received from them is the discovery of the abyss of our ignorance in relation to the universe, an ignorance the magnitude of which reason, without the information thus derived, could never have conceived. This discovery of our deficiencies must produce a great change in the determination of the aims of human reason. End footnote. The ignorant man has no conception of his ignorance, because he has no conception of knowledge. All conceptions of negatives are accordingly derived or deduced conceptions, and realities contain the data, and, so to speak, the material or transcendental content of the possibility and complete determination of all things. If, therefore, a transcendental substratum lies at the foundation of the complete determination of things, a substratum which is to form the fund from which all possible predicates of things are to be supplied, this substratum cannot be anything else than the idea of a sum total of reality, omnitudo realitatis. In this view, negations are nothing but limitations, a term which could not, with propriety, be applied to them, if the unlimited, the all, did not form the true basis of our conception. This conception of a sum total of reality is the conception of a thing in itself, regarded as completely determined, and the conception of an ens realissimum is the conception of an individual being, inasmuch as it is determined by that predicate of all possible contradictory predicates, which indicates and belongs to being. It is, therefore, a transcendental ideal which forms the basis of the complete determination of everything that exists, and is the highest material condition of its possibility, a condition on which must rest the cogitation of all objects with respect to their content. Nay, more, this ideal is the only proper ideal of which the human mind is capable, because in this case alone a general conception of a thing is completely determined by and through itself, and cognized as the representation of an individuum. The logical determination of a conception is based upon a disjunctive syllogism, the major of which contains the logical division of the extent of a general conception. The minor limits this extent to a certain part, while the conclusion determines the conception by this part. The general conception of a reality cannot be divided a priori, because, without the aid of experience, we cannot know any determinate kinds of reality, standing under the former as the genus. The transcendental principle of the complete determination of all things is therefore merely the representation of the sum total of all reality. It is not a conception which is the genus of all predicates under itself, but one which comprehends them all within itself. The complete determination of a thing is consequently based upon the limitation of this total of reality, so much being predicated of the thing, while all that remains over is excluded, a procedure which is in exact agreement with that of the disjunctive syllogism and the determination of the objects in the conclusion by one of the members of the division. It follows that reason, in laying the transcendental ideal at the foundation of its determination of all possible things, takes a course in exact analogy with that which it pursues in disjunctive syllogisms, a proposition which formed the basis of the systematic division of all transcendental ideas, according to which they are produced in complete parallelism with the three modes of syllogistic reasoning employed by the human mind. It is self-evident that reason, in cogitating the necessary complete determination of things, does not presuppose the existence of a being corresponding to its ideal, but merely the idea of the ideal, for the purpose of deducing from the unconditional totality of complete determination. The ideal is therefore the prototype of all things, which, as defective copies (ectypa), receive from it the material of their possibility, and approximate to it more or less, though it is impossible that they can ever attain to its perfection. The possibility of things must therefore be regarded as derived, except that of the thing which contains in itself all reality, which must be considered to be primitive and original. For all negations, and they are the only predicates by means of which all other things can be distinguished from the ens realismum, are mere limitations of a greater and a higher, nay, the highest, reality, and they consequently presuppose this reality, and are, as regards their content, derived from it. The manifold nature of things is only an infinitely various mode of limiting the conception of the highest reality, which is their common substratum, just as all figures are possible only as different modes of limiting infinite space. The object of the ideal of reason, an object existing only in reason itself, is also termed the primal being, ens originarium, as having no existence superior to him, the supreme being, ens summum, and as being the condition of all other beings, which rank under it, the being of all beings, ens entium. But none of these terms indicate the objective relation of an actually existing object to other things, but merely that of an idea to conceptions, and our investigations into this subject still leave us in perfect uncertainty with regard to the existence of this being. A primal being cannot be said to consist of many other beings with an existence which is derivative, for the latter presuppose the former, and therefore cannot be constitutive parts of it. It follows that the ideal of the primal being must be cogitated as simple. The deduction of the possibility of all other things from this primal being cannot, strictly speaking, be considered as a limitation, or as a kind of division of its reality, for this would be regarding the primal being as a mere aggregate, which has been shown to be impossible, although it was so represented in our first rough sketch. The highest reality must be regarded rather as the ground than as the sum total of the possibility of all things, and the manifold nature of things be based, not upon the limitation of the primal being itself, but upon the complete series of effects which flow from it. And thus all our powers of sense, as well as all phenomenal reality, may be with propriety regarded as belonging to this series of effects, while they could not have formed parts of the idea, considered as an aggregate. Pursuing this track, and hypothesizing this idea, we shall find ourselves authorized to determine our notion of the Supreme Being by means of the mere conception of a highest reality, as one, simple, all-sufficient, eternal, and so on, in one word, to determine it in its unconditioned completeness by the aid of every possible predicate. The conception of such a being is the conception of God in its transcendental sense, and thus the idea of pure reason is the object matter of a transcendental theology. But, by such an employment of the transcendental idea, we should be overstepping the limits of its validity and purpose. For reason placed it, as the conception of all reality, at the basis of the complete determination of things, without requiring that this conception be regarded as the conception of an objective existence. Such an existence would be purely fictitious, and the hypothesizing of the content of the idea into an ideal, as an individual being, is a step perfectly unauthorized. Nay, more, we are not even called upon to assume the possibility of such an hypothesis, as none of the deductions drawn from such an ideal would affect the complete determination of things in general, for the sake of which alone is the idea necessary. It is not sufficient to circumscribe the procedure and the dialectic of reason, we must also endeavour to discover the sources of this dialectic, that we may have it in our power to give a rational explanation of this illusion, as a phenomenon of the human mind. For the ideal, of which we are at present speaking, is based not upon an arbitrary, but upon a natural idea. The question hence arises, how happens it that reason regards the possibility of all things as deduced from a single possibility, that, to wit, of the highest reality, and presupposes this as existing in an individual and primal being? The answer is ready. It is at once presented by the procedure of transcendental analytic. The possibility of sensuous objects is a relation of these objects to thought, in which something, the empirical form, may be cogitated a priori, while that which constitutes the matter, the reality of the phenomenon, that element which corresponds to sensation, must be given from without, as otherwise it could not even be cogitated by, nor could its possibility be presentable to the mind. Now a sensuous object is completely determined, when it has been compared with all phenomenal predicates, and represented by means of these either positively or negatively. But, as that which constitutes the thing itself, the real in a phenomenon, must be given, and that, in which the real of all phenomena is given, is experience. One, sole, and all embracing, the material of the possibility of all sensuous objects must be presupposed as given in a whole, and it is upon the limitation of this whole that the possibility of all empirical objects, their distinction from each other and their complete determination, are based. Now, no other objects are presented to us besides sensuous objects, and these can be given only in connection with a possible experience. It follows that a thing is not an object to us unless it presupposes the whole or sum total of empirical reality as the condition of its possibility. Now, a natural illusion leads us to consider this principle, which is valid only of sensuous objects, as valid with regards to things in general. And thus we are induced to hold the empirical principle of our conceptions of the possibility of things, as phenomena, by leaving out this limitative condition, to be a transcendental principle of the possibility of things in general. We proceed afterwards to hypostasize this idea of the sum total of all reality, by changing the distributive unity of the empirical exercise of the understanding into the collective unity of an empirical whole, a dialectical illusion, and by cogitating this whole or sum of experience as an individual thing, containing in itself all empirical reality. This individual thing or being is then, by means of the above-mentioned transcendental surreption, substituted for our notion of a thing which stands at the head of the possibility of all things, the real conditions of whose complete determination it presents. Footnote 66. This ideal of the ens realissimum, although merely a mental representation, is first objectivized, that is, has an objective existence attributed to it, then hypostasized, and finally, by the natural progress of reason to the completion of unity, personified, as we shall show presently. For the regulative unity of experience is not based upon phenomena themselves, but upon the connection of the variety of phenomena by the understanding in a consciousness, and thus the unity of the supreme reality and the complete determinability of all things seem to reside in a supreme understanding and consequently in a conscious intelligence. End of section.